Welcome, weary souls seeking rest in the darkness of night, to a realm where pain shapes purpose and trauma forges the strongest bonds. Tonight, we descend into the wounded hearts of those who bear cursed energy, exploring the psychological scars that define their existence within a world that demands sacrifice from its protectors. These are the stories of broken spirits who fight not despite their pain, but because of it, carrying burdens that would crush ordinary minds while maintaining their humanity through sheer force of will. So settle into comfortable darkness. Let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of suffering transformed into strength, and allow yourself to drift as we trace the deepest wounds that carve meaning into lives lived at the intersection of power and vulnerability. Close your eyes when you're ready, and let the gentle weight of understanding embrace you as we begin our journey through the beautiful, terrible landscape of trauma that shapes every choice, every bond, every moment of courage in the endless war between protection and destruction. The train that carried 15-year-old Yuji Itadori toward his grandfather's hospital bedside moved through the autumn afternoon with mechanical indifference to the profound transformation that awaited its passenger, wheels clicking against tracks in rhythms that seemed to count down the final moments of a childhood that had already been marked by loss, but had not yet been claimed by forces beyond human comprehension. The boy who sat by the window, watching familiar landscapes blur past with the casual confidence of someone who believed that tomorrow would arrive as promised, possessed no awareness that he was traveling not just toward a deathbed, but toward a destiny that would redefine everything he understood about strength, sacrifice, and the price that love demanded from those brave enough to offer it without reservation. Wasuke Itadori lay dying with the quiet dignity that had characterized his entire approach to existence, his body failing, while his spirit maintained the fierce independence that had shaped his grandson's understanding of what it meant to live according to principles that transcended personal comfort or safety. The hospital room that contained his final hours was sterile and impersonal, equipped with machines that monitored biological functions while remaining blind to the profound wisdom that was preparing to depart the world, along with the heartbeat they measured with electronic precision. The conversation that passed between grandfather and grandson during those last precious hours was conducted with the careful, emotional control that both had learned was necessary for processing experiences too vast and complex for ordinary language to contain adequately. Wasuke's final words to Yuji were not expressions of regret or fear, but instructions for living that would prove prophetic in ways that neither could have anticipated, guidance that would sustain the boy through challenges that no 15-year-old should have been forced to face. "Help people," the dying man whispered with breath that came at increasing cost, understanding that this simple directive would provide moral foundation for choices that would determine not just his grandson's fate, but the welfare of everyone whose safety would eventually depend on decisions made by someone whose heart remained fundamentally pure, despite exposure to malevolence that corrupted stronger spirits. "Do not die alone," he added, recognizing with the clarity that sometimes accompanied approaching death that isolation was the greatest danger facing someone whose path would lead through loneliness so profound that madness would seem preferable to continued consciousness. The moment when his grandfather's heartbeat flatlined on the monitors that surrounded his bed was Yuji's first real confrontation with the finality of loss. The understanding that some departures could not be prevented through determination or love or any other force that teenage optimism might deploy against the fundamental realities that governed human existence. The silence that followed was not peaceful but crushing, weighted with awareness that the person who had provided guidance and unconditional acceptance throughout his formative years would never again offer comfort or wisdom when circumstances exceeded his capacity to navigate them independently. But the grief that threatened to overwhelm him during those first hours after his grandfather's death was interrupted by events that transformed personal loss into the beginning of a journey that would challenge every assumption he had developed about the nature of reality and his place within cosmic forces that operated according to principles too vast for ordinary comprehension. The appearance of cursed spirits at his high school that same evening was not coincidental, but symptomatic of changes that his grandfather's death had triggered in ways that no one could have predicted or prevented. The decision to consume Sukuna's finger was made in a moment of desperate calculation that had no time for proper consideration of consequences that would prove more far-reaching than any emergency could justify. Understanding that his classmates' immediate survival required action that might doom him to fates worse than death, but that inaction guaranteed their destruction. The cursed object that he swallowed without hesitation contained not just immense power, but consciousness that had spent centuries perfecting malevolence into an art form that transcended normal categories of evil. The sensation of Sukuna's presence establishing itself within his mind was unlike anything that human psychology had evolved to process. Foreign consciousness that viewed his thoughts and memories with contempt, while evaluating his body as a vessel for ambitions that encompassed the complete destruction of human civilization. The King of Curses had returned to a world that had forgotten the scope of his malevolence, and he had chosen as his host someone whose fundamental decency made him simultaneously the worst and best possible container for such overwhelming darkness. The psychological impact of sharing mental space with an entity whose very existence was antithetical to everything Yuji valued created forms of internal conflict that pushed his sanity toward breaking points that most minds could not have survived without complete dissolution of individual identity. Every moment of consciousness became a battleground where his humanity struggled against forces that sought to transform his compassion into cruelty, his protective instincts into predatory impulses, his love for others into contempt for weakness that deserved elimination rather than defense. But perhaps more devastating than Sukuna's direct psychological assault was the gradual recognition that his presence within Yuji's body made him a threat to everyone he encountered, regardless of his intentions or the careful control he attempted to maintain over manifestations of cursed energy that operated according to principles he had never been trained to understand. The people he most wanted to protect were endangered by his very existence, creating moral paradoxes that had no clean solutions and demanded choices that would haunt him regardless of which alternatives he selected. The training that followed his enrollment at Tokyo Jujutsu High was designed to help him develop conscious control over abilities that defied normal understanding while providing him with tactical knowledge necessary for surviving in a profession where mistakes typically resulted in death rather than merely failure. But no curriculum could adequately prepare him for the psychological challenges that came with being simultaneously protector and potential destroyer, savior and existential threat, human being and unwilling host to forces that sought humanity's extinction. The first mission that tested his developing capabilities in real-world circumstances revealed both his natural aptitude for the physical aspects of curse elimination and his complete inability to process the emotional weight of violence that was necessary for protecting innocent people from supernatural predators. The ease with which he could destroy cursed spirits was matched by the difficulty he experienced in accepting that such destruction was not just permissible, but essential for maintaining the safety of those who could not defend themselves against entities that viewed human suffering as entertainment. The guilt that accompanied his growing competence as a sorcerer was compounded by awareness that his existence created targeting opportunities that hostile forces could exploit to harm the very people he was training to protect. Every friendship he formed, every connection he established, every person who showed him kindness became a potential hostage that enemies could use to manipulate his behavior or force him into compromises that might result in Sukuna's complete manifestation and the catastrophic consequences that would follow. The psychological isolation that this understanding created was perhaps more damaging than the direct trauma of hosting malevolent consciousness, forcing him to maintain emotional distance from relationships that might have provided the human connection necessary for preserving sanity under impossible circumstances. The loneliness that resulted was not chosen, but imposed by circumstances that made genuine intimacy a luxury he could not afford without risking the welfare of those he claimed to care about. The event that shattered his remaining illusions about his ability to control the consequences of his unique situation occurred during what should have been a routine assignment, when circumstances forced him to witness Sukuna's manifestation and the casual efficiency with which the King of Curses eliminated threats that had been beyond Yuji's individual capability to address. The relief he felt at surviving the encounter was immediately overwhelmed by horror at the realization of what his body could become when his consciousness was suppressed or overwhelmed by forces that operated according to principles that transcended human moral considerations. The knowledge that Sukuna's power could be accessed when circumstances demanded it created temptations that were perhaps more dangerous than direct possession. Understanding that relying on such assistance would gradually erode the psychological barriers that prevented complete domination by consciousness, that viewed human civilization as an obstacle to be eliminated rather than a treasure to be protected. The line between controlled deployment of overwhelming force and surrender to malevolence was thinner than he had initially understood, requiring constant vigilance that exhausted mental resources necessary for normal emotional development. The relationships that he managed to form despite these constraints were characterized by the kind of desperate intensity that came from understanding that every shared moment might be the last before circumstances forced separation that could not be overcome through determination or loyalty or any other virtue that teenage friendship typically relied upon for sustenance. His bonds with Megumi and Nobara were forged in the crucible of shared danger, while being constantly threatened by the knowledge that his presence increased the risks they faced in pursuit of goals they shared, but that he could not pursue, without potentially dooming them to destruction. The philosophical conversations that he attempted to have with his classmates about the nature of strength and responsibility were always haunted by unspoken awareness that his perspective was shaped by experiences that they could not fully comprehend, hosting consciousness that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations while perfecting techniques for causing suffering that exceeded human imagination. The wisdom he sought to share was contaminated by proximity to malevolence that viewed such discussions as opportunities to identify weaknesses that might be exploited for psychological advantage. The internal monologue that occupied his thoughts during quiet moments was never entirely his own, Sukuna's presence providing commentary that sought to undermine every positive emotion or constructive decision with reminders of human frailty and the ultimate futility of protecting those who would eventually die regardless of his efforts. The constant psychological warfare was designed to wear down his resistance over time, gradually conditioning him to accept perspectives that would make complete possession easier when circumstances finally provided opportunities that could not be resisted or controlled. The nightmares that plagued his sleep were filled with visions of possible futures where his failure to maintain adequate control resulted in consequences that exceeded his worst fears. Cities burning under Sukuna's casual malevolence, while the faces of everyone he had failed to protect accused him of weakness that had enabled such devastation. The guilt that accompanied these dreams was compounded by awareness that they might be prophetic rather than merely psychological manifestations of genuine possibilities that required constant vigilance to prevent, rather than fantasies that could be dismissed upon waking. The gradual erosion of his sense of individual identity was perhaps the most insidious aspect of his psychological deterioration. Understanding that prolonged exposure to alien consciousness was changing him in ways that he could not fully perceive or control. The person who had consumed Sukuna's finger was slowly being replaced by someone whose thoughts and reactions were influenced by proximity to malevolence that operated according to principles that transcended human moral categories, creating hybrid consciousness that retained human appearance while being fundamentally altered by forces that sought to reshape him into something more suitable for hosting pure evil. The moments of clarity that occasionally broke through the constant psychological pressure revealed the scope of what was being lost through this gradual transformation. Memories of who he had been before his grandfather's death, and the choices that had followed becoming increasingly difficult to access, as Sukuna's presence established deeper roots within his consciousness. The boy who had wanted nothing more than to help people was being systematically dismantled by forces that viewed such aspirations as weaknesses to be exploited rather than virtues to be preserved. But perhaps most devastating was the growing recognition that his deteriorating psychological state was itself a weapon that could be used against those he cared about. His increasing instability, creating situations where his presence became liability rather than asset in circumstances that required clear thinking and emotional balance. The understanding that he was becoming the very thing he had sworn to protect people from was more traumatic than any external threat he had faced, forcing him to confront the possibility that his grandfather's dying wish might be impossible to fulfill without betraying its fundamental spirit. The conversations he attempted to have with his teachers about these psychological challenges were constrained by institutional requirements that prioritized tactical effectiveness over individual welfare. Understanding that his unique circumstances made him too valuable as a weapon to be removed from active service, regardless of the personal costs that continued deployment might exact. The support he received was genuine but limited, bounded by strategic considerations that made his individual suffering acceptable collateral damage in a larger war where his participation might determine humanity's survival. The weight of this understanding created forms of despair that threatened to overwhelm the optimistic foundation that had sustained him through previous challenges, forcing him to confront the possibility that his existence was inherently tragic, regardless of his intentions, or the care with which he attempted to minimize the risks his presence created. The hero's journey that he had unconsciously expected to follow had been revealed as illusion, replaced by recognition that his story might end in ways that validated his enemy's contempt for human weakness, rather than demonstrating the strength that came from refusing to surrender essential humanity despite impossible circumstances. The final psychological blow that nearly shattered his remaining resistance came with the understanding that the people whose welfare had motivated his initial sacrifice were themselves being damaged by association with him, their own psychological stability undermined by exposure to conflicts that exceeded normal human capacity to process without permanent alteration. The protection he had sought to provide was being transformed into contamination that spread suffering rather than alleviating it, making his continued existence a betrayal of the very principles that had motivated his original decision to accept such overwhelming responsibility. Yet within this darkness, glimmers of hope occasionally surfaced through connections that transcended the calculated manipulation that characterized most of his relationships. Moments of genuine human warmth that reminded him that love and friendship could survive even the most impossible circumstances when grounded in acceptance rather than illusion. The bonds he formed with those who understood both his potential for protection and destruction provided anchor points that prevented complete psychological dissolution, while creating reasons to continue struggling against forces that sought to transform him into something that would make such connections impossible. The understanding that his trauma was not unique, but part of a larger pattern that affected everyone who participated in the hidden war between human civilization and supernatural malevolence, provided perspective that made individual suffering bearable by placing it within a context that gave meaning to pain rather than simply inflicting it without purpose. His psychological wounds were evidence of his humanity rather than proof of his failure, scars that demonstrated his refusal to accept solutions that would eliminate suffering by abandoning the values that made such suffering meaningful. The strongest sorcerer had taught him that power without proper guidance could create monsters, but Yuji was learning, through direct experience, that trauma without proper support could achieve the same result through different mechanisms. The question that would determine his ultimate fate was whether the connections he had formed and the wisdom he had gained would prove sufficient to preserve essential humanity, despite psychological pressure that was specifically designed to erode everything that made such preservation worthwhile. The apartment building where 10-year-old Megumi Fushiguro lived with his father stood like a monument to temporary arrangements that had stretched beyond their intended duration, its concrete walls bearing witness to relationships built on convenience rather than affection, and sustained by necessity rather than choice. The morning that would mark the beginning of his real education in abandonment arrived with deceptive normalcy, sunlight filtering through windows that had never been properly cleaned, and illuminating spaces that had never been transformed into anything approaching a genuine home despite years of shared occupancy. Toji Fushiguro moved through their cramped living quarters with the restless energy of someone whose presence was conditional and temporary, gathering belongings that had never been truly unpacked, while avoiding eye contact that might have complicated his departure with emotional considerations he had trained himself not to acknowledge. The man who had fathered 2 children possessed no understanding of how to nurture them, his own psychological development having been arrested by trauma that transformed love into liability and connection into weakness that enemies could exploit. The conversation that should have provided explanation for his father's departure was conducted through the kind of emotional distance that characterized all their interactions. Practical arrangements discussed with the same detachment that might accompany negotiations between strangers who shared temporary accommodations, rather than family members whose separation would create permanent psychological wounds. Toji's instructions about money and contact information were delivered with mechanical precision that revealed nothing about whatever complex emotions might have motivated his decision to abandon responsibilities that most adults would have considered sacred. Megumi's response to this abandonment was not the explosive grief that might have been expected from a child facing the loss of his primary caregiver, but a form of psychological withdrawal that protected him from experiencing the full impact of rejection, while creating emotional barriers that would prove nearly impossible to dismantle throughout his subsequent development. The 10-year-old boy, who watched his father walk away, understood intuitively that survival required accepting that love was unreliable, and that depending on others for security was a mistake that could prove catastrophic when circumstances inevitably changed. The silence that filled their apartment after Toji's departure was not peaceful but oppressive, weighted with awareness that the person who should have provided protection and guidance had chosen personal freedom over parental obligation, leaving behind a child whose supernatural abilities were beginning to manifest in ways that required supervision and training that no institutional system was equipped to provide. The cursed technique that Megumi had inherited, along with his father's abandonment, carried power that could reshape reality, but came without instructions for controlling forces that operated according to principles beyond ordinary human comprehension. The first manifestation of his 10 Shadows technique occurred during a moment of emotional crisis, when his psychological defenses were overwhelmed by the accumulated stress of processing abandonment while attempting to maintain the facade of normalcy that social services required to avoid institutional intervention. The divine dogs that emerged from his shadow were not mere supernatural phenomena, but externalized representations of his need for companionship and protection, creatures that could provide loyalty that human relationships had proven incapable of sustaining. But even this miraculous ability came with psychological costs that exceeded any benefits it might have provided. Understanding that the power flowing through his bloodline was the same force that had marked him as valuable enough to abandon rather than worthless enough to ignore. The Zenin family's interest in his development was motivated not by concern for his welfare, but by recognition that his inherited techniques represented resources that could be exploited for institutional advancement, making him simultaneously precious and disposable, depending on how effectively his abilities could be developed and deployed. The foster care arrangements that followed his father's disappearance were characterized by the kind of institutional efficiency that prioritized paperwork compliance over emotional support, social workers processing his case with professional competence that remained blind to psychological wounds that could not be addressed through bureaucratic procedures. The temporary placements that defined his early adolescence were conducted with adults who viewed him as obligation rather than opportunity, providing basic necessities while maintaining emotional distance that protected them from becoming invested in outcomes they could not control. The academic performance that he maintained, despite these impossible circumstances, reflected not natural resilience, but desperate determination to avoid drawing attention that might result in closer scrutiny of his living situation or his increasingly obvious supernatural abilities. The grades and behavioral evaluations that kept him within normal parameters required constant effort that exhausted psychological resources necessary for processing trauma, while preventing him from developing the social connections that might have provided emotional support during his most vulnerable period. The discovery of his sister Sumiki's existence was perhaps the only genuinely positive development during these formative years, though even this blessing came with complications that tested his capacity for forming attachments that had been damaged by his father's abandonment and the institutional neglect that had followed. The older girl who entered his life represented both opportunity for genuine human connection and additional responsibility that he was poorly equipped to handle, given his own emotional instability and lack of experience with healthy relationships. Sumiki's natural warmth and determination to create family bonds that transcended their complicated circumstances provided Megumi with his first experience of unconditional acceptance since his father's departure, but her affection also created vulnerabilities that he had learned to avoid through emotional isolation. The fear that he might lose her the way he had lost everyone else who mattered to him created forms of psychological pressure that made genuine intimacy nearly impossible, despite his desperate need for exactly the kind of connection she was offering. The apartment they shared became a sanctuary where he could experience brief moments of normalcy while understanding that such peace was temporary and conditional, dependent on his ability to maintain control over abilities that were growing stronger while remaining dangerously unstable. The cursed energy that flowed through his developing technique was responding to emotional states that he had never learned to regulate properly, creating situations where his inner turmoil manifested as external threats that could endanger the person whose welfare had become his primary motivation for continued existence. The night that would change everything forever began with the kind of false calm that preceded supernatural disasters. Tsumiki preparing for what should have been an ordinary evening while Megumi struggled with premonitions that his abilities were beginning to provide without explanation or context. The bridge where she would encounter the cursed object that would claim her consciousness was miles away from their apartment, but his 10 Shadows technique was already responding to disturbances in the spiritual atmosphere that surrounded events he had no power to prevent or predict. The phone call that informed him of her condition was delivered with the clinical detachment that medical professionals employed when discussing cases that exceeded normal understanding. Her sudden lapse into catatonic unconsciousness, explained through terminology that obscured rather than illuminated the supernatural forces that had claimed her mind. The curse that had contaminated her was beyond the reach of conventional treatment, its effects requiring intervention from Jujutsu specialists who operated according to principles that ordinary medicine could not acknowledge or address. The hospital room where Tsumiki lay unconscious became a shrine to powerlessness, monitoring equipment, tracking biological functions that continued operating, while her consciousness remained trapped within supernatural constraints that no amount of love or determination could overcome. The sister who had provided his only experience of genuine family had been claimed by the same forces that had shaped his cursed technique, creating a connection between his inherited power and her suffering that filled him with guilt too vast for his adolescent psychology to process effectively. The arrival of Satoru Gojo in his life during this crisis was simultaneously salvation and additional burden, the strongest sorcerer's offer of training and support coming at the cost of acknowledging that his sister's condition was directly related to his own supernatural nature. The deal that he made to attend Tokyo Jujutsu High was motivated not by personal ambition, but by desperate hope that developing his abilities might eventually provide him with the power necessary to restore Tsumiki to consciousness and health. But the training that followed revealed that power alone was insufficient to address the complex supernatural forces that had claimed his sister, understanding that her curse was part of larger patterns that extended far beyond individual capability to resolve through technical mastery or emotional determination. The strongest sorcerer in the world could not guarantee her recovery, making Megumi's sacrifice of normal adolescence a gesture of faith rather than a strategic calculation with predictable outcomes. The psychological weight of this uncertainty was compounded by his growing understanding of what his inherited technique represented within the broader context of Jujutsu history, learning that the 10 Shadows had previously produced individuals whose power had exceeded even the legendary Gojo family's capabilities. The expectation that he might someday surpass his teacher in strength created pressures that threatened to overwhelm someone whose emotional foundation had been damaged by abandonment and loss. The combat training that occupied his days at Tokyo Jujutsu High revealed both his natural aptitude for the tactical aspects of curse elimination and his profound reluctance to embrace the kind of aggressive confidence that effective sorcery typically required. His approach to conflict was characterized by careful calculation rather than instinctive dominance, reflecting psychological patterns that had been established through years of understanding that mistakes carried costs that extended far beyond personal consequences. The relationships that he formed with his classmates were constrained by emotional barriers that he had constructed to protect himself from experiencing additional abandonment, creating connections that were genuine, but limited in ways that prevented the kind of deep intimacy that might have provided healing for wounds that had been accumulating since childhood. His friendship with Yuji and Nobara was real but guarded, characterized by mutual respect and tactical cooperation, rather than the vulnerable emotional sharing that true healing would have required. The philosophical discussions that emerged during their training revealed the extent to which his worldview had been shaped by experiences of loss and abandonment. His understanding of strength and protection informed by intimate knowledge of how quickly safety could be destroyed by forces beyond individual control. The cynicism that characterized his approach to heroic ideals was not cruelty, but defensive mechanism, protection against disappointment that had proven too devastating to risk experiencing again. The missions that tested his developing abilities in real-world circumstances forced him to confront the gap between his desire to protect others and his deep-seated fear of forming attachments that might make such protection emotionally meaningful rather than merely tactical. The ease with which he could deploy his Shikigami in combat was matched by the difficulty he experienced in accepting that his classmates might be willing to risk themselves for his welfare, creating internal conflicts that undermined his effectiveness while revealing the psychological damage that years of emotional isolation had created. The encounter with his father during the events at Tokyo Jujutsu High created a form of trauma that transcended even his previous experiences of abandonment. Understanding that the man who had shaped his early understanding of relationships had been revealed as someone whose capacity for violence exceeded anything that his childhood memories had preserved. The recognition that Toji had been capable of murder while remaining unable to sustain emotional connection with his own children shattered assumptions about human nature that had provided some measure of stability despite their fundamental pessimism. But perhaps more devastating than learning about his father's criminal career was the realization that Toji's final moments had been spent protecting rather than abandoning him, suggesting that love had existed beneath layers of psychological damage that had made its expression impossible during the years when such expression might have prevented the emotional wounds that defined Megumi's approach to relationships. The knowledge that his father had chosen death rather than harming his son created guilt that was perhaps more difficult to bear than the original abandonment had been. The year that followed this revelation was characterized by gradual recognition that his psychological patterns were not fixed destiny, but learned responses that could be modified through experiences that challenged his assumptions about human reliability and the possibility of sustainable emotional connection. The bonds that he formed with his classmates proved more durable than his cynicism had predicted, creating foundation for growth that had seemed impossible during his isolation. The culling game that would test everything he had learned about strength and connection was also the circumstance that would force him to confront his deepest fears about powerlessness and abandonment. Understanding that the people he had finally allowed himself to care about would face dangers that exceeded his individual capacity to address, regardless of how thoroughly he had developed his inherited techniques. The possibility of losing everyone who mattered to him, while being unable to prevent such losses, recreated the trauma of his childhood within contexts that made the stakes cosmic rather than merely personal. But it was his possession by Sukuna that represented the ultimate violation of boundaries that he had spent years constructing to protect himself from experiencing the kind of vulnerability that had made his father's abandonment so devastating. The consciousness that invaded his mind was not content with controlling his body, but sought to corrupt the values and relationships that he had finally learned to treasure, using his own emotions against him in ways that transformed love into weapon and connection into liability. The knowledge that his technique had been used to kill Satoru Gojo created guilt that exceeded anything he had previously experienced. Understanding that his failure to maintain adequate resistance against possession had resulted in the death of the person who had provided stability and guidance during his most vulnerable years. The irony that his inherited power had been turned against the strongest sorcerer was not lost on him, fulfilling predictions about his potential in ways that destroyed rather than validated everything that his training had been intended to achieve. The psychological aftermath of this possession was characterized by forms of self-hatred that threatened to complete the destruction that Sukuna had begun. His sense of individual agency, compromised by awareness that his body and technique could be used for purposes that contradicted every value he had developed through years of careful moral development. The violation of his autonomy was complete and permanent, creating trauma that exceeded even his experiences of abandonment, because it involved betrayal by his own capabilities, rather than merely by other people. The conversations with his surviving classmates that followed were conducted through barriers of guilt and shame that made genuine communication nearly impossible. Understanding that his presence created risks that might make him liability, rather than asset in their continued struggle against forces that had already cost them too much. The isolation that resulted was self-imposed but felt as devastating as any external abandonment he had experienced, creating psychological conditions that validated his earliest fears about the impossibility of sustainable human connection. Yet within this darkness, the relationships that had survived previous challenges continued to provide foundation for recovery that seemed impossible, but remained necessary if he was to contribute meaningfully to the ongoing struggle that had claimed so many of the people he had learned to value. The bonds that connected him to his remaining classmates had been tested by trauma that exceeded normal human capacity to endure, but they had not been broken entirely, creating possibilities for healing that honored both his wounds and his continued commitment to protection. The understanding that his suffering was not unique, but part of a larger pattern that affected everyone who participated in the Jujutsu world, provided perspective that made individual trauma bearable by placing it within contexts that gave meaning to pain rather than simply inflicting it without purpose. His psychological wounds were evidence of his humanity rather than proof of his weakness, scars that demonstrated his refusal to accept solutions that would eliminate vulnerability by abandoning the connections that made such vulnerability meaningful. The boy who had been abandoned by his father had learned through direct experience that the greatest strength came not from avoiding attachment, but from maintaining it, despite awareness that loss was inevitable and abandonment was possible. The technique that he had inherited carried power that could reshape reality, but the relationships he had chosen to preserve carried meaning that made such power worth wielding in service of others, rather than merely for personal advancement or protection. The shadow that had been his constant companion since childhood now carried within it not just the potential for summoning protective spirits, but the memory of everyone he had lost and everyone he had chosen to continue protecting despite the costs that such protection had demanded from his psychological stability and emotional well-being. Megumi Fushiguro had been shaped by abandonment, but he had not been destroyed by it, finding instead ways to transform trauma into wisdom and isolation, into selective but profound connection with others, who understood that strength meant choosing to care despite every reason to surrender to protective indifference. The village where Nobara Kujisaki spent her formative years was the kind of place where ambition was treated as betrayal and dreams were viewed with the suspicious hostility that small communities reserved for anything that suggested their limitations might be choices rather than inevitable circumstances. The narrow streets that connected modest houses held generations of people who had learned to find satisfaction in predictable routines, while viewing any deviation from established patterns as evidence of dangerous arrogance that threatened the social stability their ancestors had purchased through systematic surrender of individual aspiration. Nobara moved through this environment with the unconscious defiance of someone whose natural temperament was fundamentally incompatible with expectations that prioritized conformity over excellence. Her personality, expressing itself through small acts of rebellion that accumulated into patterns her neighbors found simultaneously admirable and threatening. The 8-year-old girl who refused to apologize for taking up space possessed no understanding of how thoroughly her confidence challenged assumptions about appropriate feminine behavior that had shaped community dynamics for generations. The friendship that would define her understanding of loyalty and loss began with the arrival of Saori, a girl whose family had moved from Tokyo with the kind of urban sophistication that made her simultaneously fascinating and suspect to established residents who had learned to distrust anything that suggested broader possibilities existed beyond their geographical and psychological boundaries. The connection that developed between them was immediate and intense, based on mutual recognition of spirits that refused to accept limitation as virtue or ambition as vice. Saori's presence in Nobara's life provided the first glimpse of what existence might offer beyond the constraints that had defined her community for generations. Conversations about fashion and culture and possibilities that extended far beyond anything that local experience had prepared her to imagine. The friendship that bloomed between them was characterized by the kind of desperate intensity that came from understanding that such connection was rare and precious, requiring protection against forces that viewed it as threat to social harmony rather than evidence of human potential. But the very qualities that made Saori valuable as a friend also made her vulnerable to community pressure that operated through systematic exclusion and subtle harassment designed to encourage voluntary departure rather than explicit confrontation that might have attracted unwanted attention from authorities who could have challenged such behavior. The psychological warfare that rural communities could wage against outsiders was sophisticated and relentless, employing social mechanisms that had been refined through generations of practice in eliminating elements that threatened established hierarchies. The campaign against Saori was conducted with the kind of collective coordination that small towns could achieve when their fundamental assumptions were challenged by presence that suggested alternative approaches to existence were not just possible but potentially superior to traditions that had provided stability at the cost of growth. The isolation that gradually surrounded her was not accidental but systematic, designed to make her family's continued residence psychologically unbearable, without creating obvious targets for legal intervention or external criticism. Nobara's attempts to defend her friend were hampered by her own youth and lack of understanding about how adult social dynamics operated, her straightforward approach to conflict proving inadequate against manipulation that worked through indirection and plausible denial rather than open hostility. The protection she tried to provide was genuine but insufficient, limited by resources and knowledge that would not be available to her for years to come, if ever. The morning that Saori's family departed without saying goodbye was Nobara's first real education in how completely external forces could destroy relationships that seemed secure and permanent, understanding that love and loyalty were not always sufficient to overcome circumstances that exceeded individual control. The empty house that had contained her most important friendship stood as monument to powerlessness that no amount of determination or anger could remedy through direct action. The letter that arrived weeks later provided explanation for the sudden departure, while highlighting the impossibility of maintaining connection across distances that were measured not just in geography but in social class and opportunity. Saori's words were kind but final, acknowledging their friendship while making clear that her future lay in directions that would make continued contact impractical, regardless of how much both might have wanted to preserve bonds that had been severed by forces beyond their influence. The psychological impact of this loss was complicated by Nobara's growing recognition that her community's treatment of Saori revealed attitudes and assumptions that would inevitably be directed toward anyone whose aspirations exceeded locally acceptable parameters, including herself, if she continued to express ambitions that challenged established expectations about appropriate life paths for young women from rural backgrounds. The rejection that had driven away her friend was preview of what she might face if she refused to moderate her own dreams and personality to conform with social requirements that prioritized harmony over authenticity. But rather than accepting this lesson as instruction to surrender her individual nature in exchange for social acceptance, Nobara processed Saori's departure as evidence that escape was not just desirable, but necessary for psychological survival in environments that treated personal growth as community betrayal. The armor she began constructing around her emotions was designed not to eliminate vulnerability, but to protect essential aspects of her personality from pressures that sought to reshape her into something more acceptable to people whose approval she had decided was not worth the cost. They demanded. The aggressive confidence that became her trademark during adolescence was simultaneously authentic expression of her natural temperament and defensive mechanism that prevented others from perceiving weaknesses that might be exploited by those who viewed her ambitions as threats requiring elimination. The persona she developed was real but incomplete, revealing genuine aspects of her character while concealing doubts and fears that she had learned were too dangerous to expose in environments that would interpret such vulnerability as invitation for attack. The academic excellence that marked her high school years was achieved through determination that exceeded mere scholarly ambition, understanding that superior performance was her only realistic path toward opportunities that would allow escape from geographical and social constraints that had already demonstrated their capacity for destroying what she valued most. The grades and achievements that accumulated in her record were weapons in a war for independence, rather than simple expressions of intellectual curiosity or competitive drive. The isolation that accompanied this excellence was both chosen and imposed, reflecting her deliberate distance from classmates whose limited aspirations she found simultaneously pitiable and threatening, while acknowledging that genuine friendship required vulnerabilities she could no longer afford to risk. The loneliness that resulted was painful but preferable to the alternative of allowing others close enough to attempt the kind of psychological manipulation that had already cost her the most important relationship of her life. The application to Tokyo Jujutsu High represented more than career choice or educational opportunity, but fundamental rejection of everything that her community had offered as acceptable life path, understanding that her supernatural abilities provided justification for escape that might otherwise have been viewed as abandonment of family obligations and social responsibilities. The cursed energy that flowed through her technique was simultaneously burden and liberation, marking her as different in ways that could not be denied or normalized through social pressure. The straw doll technique that manifested her power was perfectly suited to someone whose understanding of conflict had been shaped by experiences with enemies who operated through indirection and manipulation rather than honest confrontation, allowing her to strike at opponents through connections that transcended physical proximity while reflecting her own psychological relationship with vulnerability and control. The voodoo-like principles that governed her abilities resonated with someone who had learned that the most effective attacks were often those that could not be defended against through conventional means. But even this remarkable ability came with psychological costs that exceeded any advantages it might have provided. Understanding that her technique required personal items from opponents that created intimate connections, she was not emotionally prepared to process healthily. Given her history with relationships that had been destroyed by forces beyond her control, the very mechanism that made her effective as a sorcerer also forced her to engage with forms of closeness that her defensive systems were designed to prevent. The arrival at Tokyo Jujutsu High was simultaneously homecoming and exile, providing access to urban sophistication that had been denied to her throughout her rural childhood, while separating her permanently from geographical origins that had shaped her understanding of herself and her place in social hierarchies that extended beyond individual choice or merit. The city that welcomed her was also the city that made return to previous life impossible, regardless of how her educational experience might develop. The classmates who became her closest companions during training were selected not through natural affinity, but through tactical assessment of who could be trusted with limited emotional investment without compromising her effectiveness or psychological stability. Yuji's genuine kindness was appealing but dangerous, threatening to create vulnerabilities that her defensive systems were designed to prevent, while Megumi's emotional distance was both familiar and frustrating. Recognizing someone whose protective mechanisms operated through different strategies while serving similar psychological functions. The training exercises that tested her developing abilities revealed both her natural aptitude for combat applications of cursed energy and her profound discomfort with scenarios that required relying on others for support or protection. That she had learned was unreliable, regardless of how sincere initial offers might appear. Her approach to teamwork was characterized by competent cooperation that maintained emotional barriers designed to prevent the kind of dependency that had made Saori's departure so devastating. The missions that provided real-world testing of her capabilities created opportunities for demonstrating effectiveness that validated her decision to pursue strength as solution to powerlessness, while forcing her to confront limitations that individual excellence could not overcome, regardless of how thoroughly she had developed her personal techniques. The balance between self-reliance and tactical cooperation required constant adjustment that challenged assumptions about independence while highlighting benefits that came from connections she remained reluctant to trust completely. The encounter with Mahito that would define the trajectory of her subsequent development began as routine assignment that should have provided straightforward opportunity for demonstrating competence while contributing to team objectives that aligned with her personal goals for growth and advancement. The special grade curse that awaited them possessed capabilities that exceeded intelligence estimates while demonstrating interest in psychological warfare that targeted exactly the kinds of vulnerabilities that she had spent years learning to protect through aggressive confidence and emotional distance. The technique that Mahito employed against her was designed not just to cause physical damage, but to attack the fundamental connection between consciousness and identity that defined human existence, forcing her to experience dissolution of boundaries that she had constructed between self and world through years of careful psychological development. The assault on her soul was simultaneously intimate and impersonal, reflecting malevolence that viewed human suffering as entertainment, rather than recognizing the profound courage required to maintain individual identity despite circumstances that provided every justification for surrender. The moment when her consciousness began fragmenting under pressure that exceeded human capacity to endure was perhaps the most terrifying experience of her entire existence. Understanding that the strength she had cultivated through years of discipline and determination was inadequate to prevent destruction that operated according to principles that transcended normal categories of conflict and resolution. The technique that was unmaking her operated at levels that exceeded physical or mental defense while attacking essential aspects of identity that defined her as individual rather than merely biological organism. But even as her sense of self began dissolving under supernatural assault that should have resulted in immediate death or permanent psychological damage, the core of defiance that had sustained her through childhood isolation and social rejection proved more resilient than the curse had anticipated. The anger that had motivated her escape from rural limitations transformed into a weapon that could resist dissolution while maintaining enough coherence to continue fighting despite trauma that would have destroyed someone whose identity was based on more conventional foundations. The intervention that saved her from complete destruction came at costs that would not become apparent until much later. Understanding that survival had been purchased through changes that would affect every aspect of her subsequent existence in ways that could not be predicted or controlled through conscious effort. The rescue that preserved her life had not prevented all damage from Mahito's technique, leaving questions about the extent of modification that might influence her psychological and spiritual development in directions that remained unknown. The recovery period that followed was characterized by forms of uncertainty that challenged every assumption she had developed about the reliability of her own identity and capabilities. Understanding that survival did not guarantee that essential aspects of her personality had remained unchanged by exposure to forces that operated beyond normal human comprehension. The person who had entered the battle was not necessarily the same person who had emerged from it, creating existential questions that no amount of medical evaluation could resolve definitively. The conversations with her classmates about her condition were constrained by her inability to articulate experiences that exceeded normal language, while their responses reflected confusion and concern that highlighted the gap between her internal reality and their capacity to understand trauma that operated through mechanisms they had never encountered directly. The isolation that resulted was familiar but newly painful, recognizing that her defensive systems were inadequate for processing challenges that transcended normal categories of psychological threat. The return to active duty that followed was motivated not by confidence in her complete recovery, but by desperate need to prove that she remained capable of contributing meaningfully to objectives that had provided purpose during her development as sorcerer. The missions that tested her restored capabilities revealed both resilience that exceeded expectations and subtle changes that suggested permanent alteration in ways that might prove significant in circumstances that had not yet been encountered. The philosophical questions that emerged from her near-death experience were focused not on meaning or purpose, but on the fundamental nature of identity and the mechanisms through which individual consciousness maintained coherence despite exposure to forces that sought to unmake the very categories through which human existence organized itself into recognizable patterns. The uncertainty that accompanied these questions was more disturbing than the physical trauma she had endured, challenging assumptions about selfhood that had provided foundation for all her previous development. But perhaps most significantly, the experience had revealed that the aggressive confidence she had cultivated as protection against social manipulation was insufficient defense against threats that operated through different mechanisms while creating forms of vulnerability that her psychological armor had never been designed to address. The persona that had served her well in human conflicts required modification to remain effective in supernatural contexts that exceeded the scope of problems that rural social dynamics had prepared her to navigate. The understanding that her survival had been dependent not just on individual strength, but on connections with classmates whose support had proved decisive challenged assumptions about independence, while creating obligations that she was not prepared to acknowledge or reciprocate according to patterns that normal friendship typically required. The debt she owed to others for her continued existence was simultaneously meaningful and threatening, representing exactly the kind of dependency that her defensive systems were designed to prevent. Yet within this confusion and uncertainty, something fundamental about her character had been validated through survival of circumstances that would have destroyed someone whose identity was based on more conventional foundations. The defiance that had motivated her escape from rural limitations had proved sufficient to resist dissolution, while maintaining enough coherence to continue fighting, despite trauma that exceeded normal human capacity to endure without permanent psychological damage. Nobara Kujisaki had entered the battle as someone whose strength was based on careful construction of protective barriers that prevented others from perceiving or exploiting vulnerabilities that experience had taught her were too dangerous to expose. She had emerged as someone whose understanding of strength had been complicated by recognition that survival sometimes required exactly the kind of connection and dependency that her entire approach to relationships had been designed to avoid, creating possibilities for growth that honored both her wounds and her continued commitment to protecting what she had learned to value, despite the cost such protection might demand from her psychological stability and emotional independence. The hospital room, where Satoru Gojo drew his first breath on the 7th of December 1989, was transformed in that instant. From ordinary medical facility into the epicenter of cosmic rebalancing that would echo through the Jujutsu world for generations to come. The moment his lungs filled with air, cursed spirits across Japan felt a tremor in the fabric of their existence, understanding without conscious thought that something fundamental had changed in the eternal war between human civilization and the forces that sought its destruction through systematic cultivation of fear and despair. The eyes that opened for the first time were not the cloudy blue of ordinary infants, but something far more profound and unsettling. Depths that seemed to stretch into infinity, while pupils reflected not light, but the very concept of space itself, made manifest in biological form. The attending physicians, all non-sorcerers blessed with ignorance about supernatural forces that shaped their world in ways they could never comprehend, felt inexplicable chill when they looked into those eyes, as if they were gazing into something vast and incomprehensible that gazed back with equal intensity and infinitely superior understanding. The Gojo family elders, who gathered to witness this birth, understood immediately what they were seeing in ways that transcended mere recognition of inherited technique or ancestral blessing, perceiving instead the emergence of something that approached divine manifestation within human form. The Six Eyes had returned to the world after centuries of absence, paired impossibly with the limitless technique in a combination that had not graced the earth for over 400 years, creating potential that exceeded every previous expression of their bloodline's supernatural gifts. But divine blessing, as the elders knew from centuries of family history preserved in archives that documented both triumph and tragedy with equal precision, was indistinguishable from divine curse. When viewed from the perspective of those who were chosen to bear such overwhelming responsibility, the infant who lay sleeping in his crib would never know the comfort of weakness, the safety of insignificance, or the peace of mediocrity that allowed ordinary people to move through their lives without constant awareness that their choices carried consequences extending far beyond personal comfort or individual survival. The first assassination attempt came when Satoru was only 3 months old, orchestrated by curse users who believed that overwhelming potential could be eliminated before it achieved full manifestation if attacked during the brief window when supernatural ability had not yet integrated with conscious awareness and defensive capability. The assassin who infiltrated the Gojo compound that night possessed techniques specifically designed to kill targets before their power could develop beyond theoretical possibility, understanding that delay would transform manageable threat into existential challenge that might prove impossible to address through conventional methods. He made it as far as the nursery before discovering that potential and actuality were not the same thing when it came to the 6 eyes. The infant Satoru opening eyes that saw not just the assassin's physical form but the entirety of his cursed energy, the flow of his techniques, and the trajectory of his attack before conscious intention had translated into physical motion. What happened next was never fully explained to the family, only that they found the would-be killer the next morning, alive but forever changed, sitting in the corner of the nursery repeating over and over again that he had seen infinity itself looking back at him from eyes that should have held nothing more threatening than childhood innocence. This incident established patterns that would define Satoru's early years in ways that transformed what should have been normal childhood development into careful cultivation of abilities that exceeded adult comprehension while maintaining the emotional and psychological foundation necessary to prevent power from corrupting essential humanity that gave such power, meaning, and purpose. The bounty on his head grew larger with each failed attempt, attracting increasingly sophisticated and desperate individuals who believed they could succeed where others had failed through superior technique or more careful preparation. The Gojo family's response to these constant threats was to surround their heir with layers of protection that transformed his childhood into a strange combination of luxury and imprisonment, the compound where he lived becoming fortress, staffed by the most skilled sorcerers money could hire, while every person who came into contact with him was subjected to background investigations that traced their histories back generations. The security measures that preserved his life also ensured his isolation from normal human interaction, creating conditions where his development proceeded according to principles that had no precedent in conventional child psychology. The training sessions that occupied his earliest years were designed to help him understand and control abilities that defied normal comprehension, while providing him with theoretical framework necessary to integrate supernatural perception with ordinary human consciousness in ways that preserved sanity despite exposure to information that most minds could not process without permanent psychological damage. The limitless technique required mathematical precision that most adults never achieved, but his 6 eyes provided computational power that transformed impossible calculations into intuitive understanding that operated below conscious awareness. The isolation that came with his extraordinary gifts became apparent early in his development through interactions with other children who instinctively kept their distance despite being raised in environments where supernatural abilities were acknowledged and cultivated rather than hidden or denied. There was something in his gaze that made them uncomfortable in ways they could not articulate. Sensed that he was seeing not just their faces, but something deeper and more intimate than they were prepared to share with someone whose power exceeded their capacity to understand or reciprocate. His parents, devoted but overwhelmed by the magnitude of their son's destiny, struggled to provide normal childhood experiences while acknowledging that normalcy was perhaps the one thing their son would never be permitted to enjoy without compromising development that carried implications extending far beyond family welfare. Birthday parties became formal gatherings where political alliances were negotiated between families whose children would someday inherit responsibility for maintaining balances that kept their hidden worlds stable, while bedtime stories were replaced with lessons in Jujutsu history and philosophy that prepared him for burdens that no child should have been forced to contemplate. The weight of expectations pressed down on Satoru from every direction, with intensity that would have crushed ordinary spirits, but that he carried with casual grace that suggested either remarkable resilience or complete lack of bearing. Understanding about what such expectations might demand from his psychological development and emotional stability, the Gojo family saw him as their ultimate triumph, culmination of centuries of careful breeding and political maneuvering that had finally produced heir worthy of their ancestral legacy, while the broader Jujutsu society viewed him as either salvation or potential destroyer, depending on how his moral development proceeded under pressures that had transformed previous exceptional individuals into forces for protection or annihilation. The philosophical questions that would later define his teaching career began forming in his mind during these early years of isolation and training, understanding even at young age that his strength was not just personal attribute, but responsibility that would define every choice he made for the rest of his existence. The Six Eyes showed him not just what was, but what could be, revealing countless possibilities that flowed from every decision while highlighting moral weight that accompanied power sufficient to reshape reality according to individual will rather than collective consensus or institutional authority. The loneliness that would characterize his adult relationships was established during these formative years when he learned that being strongest meant being forever separated from others by barriers more impermeable than any physical wall, because they were constructed from fundamental incompatibility between absolute power and genuine human connection. He could see everything, understand everyone, protect them all, but he could never truly be one of them, never experience comfort of vulnerability or safety of being someone else's responsibility, rather than bearing ultimate accountability for outcomes that affected millions of people who would never know his name or appreciate his Bema sacrifices. The academic education that supplemented his jujutsu training was conducted by tutors who possessed not just scholarly expertise, but understanding of how to teach someone whose cognitive abilities exceeded normal parameters, while his emotional development remained constrained by isolation that prevented formation of relationships necessary for healthy psychological growth. The curriculum was designed to challenge intellect that operated at superhuman levels, while providing moral framework that might prevent power from corrupting essential humanity that made protection meaningful rather than merely tactical. The first time Satoru successfully maintained infinity around himself for extended period represented breakthrough that transformed theoretical possibility into practical reality. Space-time distorting around him in ways that made direct physical contact impossible, while attacks simply ceased to exist in meaningful sense when they encountered barriers he had created through pure force of will backed by supernatural perception. The technique was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, demonstration of power that approached divine authority over fundamental forces, while highlighting isolation that such authority inevitably created. But even this remarkable achievement came with psychological costs that exceeded any tactical advantages it might have provided. Understanding that perfect defense also meant perfect separation from human contact, that normal development required for emotional health and social competence. The barrier that protected him from every physical threat also prevented him from experiencing touch, warmth, or any other form of direct human connection that might have provided comfort during moments when power felt more like burden than blessing. The conversations he attempted to maintain with family members and tutors during this period revealed growing gulf between his internal experience and their capacity to understand what he was becoming, exchanges that felt like translations between fundamentally incompatible languages. Despite shared vocabulary and cultural reference points, when he tried to explain sensation of perceiving reality through six eyes or mathematical elegance of manipulating space at quantum level, their responses reflected polite interest rather than genuine comprehension, creating loneliness that exceeded mere social isolation because it involved fundamental inability to share experiences that defined his existence. The missions that began during his early adolescence provided opportunities to apply developing abilities in real-world circumstances, while demonstrating to institutional authorities that their investment in his protection and education was producing results worthy of continued support and resource allocation. The cursed spirits he eliminated were dispatched with efficiency that made such encounters seem trivial, despite representing threats that would have challenged most professional sorcerers, his techniques operating with precision that transformed combat into something approaching artistic expression. But the ease with which he could destroy supernatural threats was matched by difficulty he experienced in processing emotional weight of violence that was necessary for protecting innocent people from entities that viewed human suffering as entertainment rather than recognizing profound courage required to maintain civilization despite constant pressure from forces that sought its destruction. The guilt that accompanied his growing competence was not logical but emotional, reflecting innate understanding that taking life, even monstrous life, carried moral weight that could not be eliminated through rational analysis of necessity or tactical consideration of alternatives. The breakthrough that would define his adult approach to power and responsibility occurred during mission that should have been routine demonstration of capability, but instead became moment of profound philosophical awakening that shaped his understanding of what strength meant when wielded by someone whose abilities exceeded normal categories of human achievement. The curse he faced possessed sufficient intelligence to engage in psychological warfare that targeted his deepest fears about isolation and meaninglessness, forcing him to confront possibility that his power was separating him from humanity he was sworn to protect. The realization that his strength could become obstacle to genuine human connection rather than tool for protecting what he valued most was perhaps more devastating than any physical injury he might have sustained. Understanding that perfect technique and flawless victory were meaningless if achieved at cost of losing touch with values that gave such achievement significance beyond mere demonstration of superior capability. The strongest sorcerer was also the loneliest person, creating paradox that no amount of additional power could resolve through direct application of force or technical mastery. The period that followed this revelation was characterized by systematic examination of every assumption he had developed about power, responsibility, and relationship between individual capability and collective welfare, understanding that his approach to strength needed modification if it was to serve constructive rather than merely destructive purposes. The philosophical framework that emerged from this analysis would eventually inform his teaching methods while providing foundation for relationships that transcended simple hierarchy between protector and protected. The decision to embrace role as educator rather than merely warrior was motivated not by altruistic desire to share knowledge, but by recognition that his individual strength, regardless of its magnitude, was insufficient to address challenges that required collective action and shared commitment to values that transcended personal interest or tribal loyalty. The students he would eventually train represented not just next generation of sorcerers, but potential solutions to problems that his own approach had revealed but could not resolve through overwhelming force alone. The Star Plasma Vessel mission, that would shatter his assumptions about reliability of power as solution to moral problems, began as assignment that seemed perfectly suited to his capabilities. Protection detail that required exactly the kind of overwhelming strength and precise technique that he had spent years developing through careful training and practical application. The girl they were assigned to protect was 14 years old, possessed of bright intelligence and remarkable courage that made her worthy of protection, while highlighting tragic necessity of her sacrifice for greater good that no amount of individual strength could eliminate. But the friendship that developed during those brief days transformed what should have been professional obligation into personal investment that made failure unthinkable, while creating emotional vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit to achieve tactical advantages that pure power could not prevent. Riko Amanai was not passive victim awaiting rescue, but vibrant young person trying to extract meaning and joy from brief time remaining to her, courage in face of inevitable dissolution that exceeded anything his own privileged existence had required him to demonstrate. The assassination that ended her life came not through overwhelming supernatural force, but through mundane precision of rifle shot, fired by someone who understood that even absolute power could be circumvented by sufficient preparation and tactical intelligence, bullet finding its target with mechanical accuracy that bypassed every defense his techniques could provide. The silence that followed gunshots seemed to stretch for eternity, encompassing not just immediate shock of witnessing sudden death, but gradual realization that his failure would have consequences extending far beyond personal grief. The battle with Toji Fushiguro that followed represented his first encounter with genuine vulnerability since early childhood, facing an opponent whose technique was specifically designed to exploit overconfidence that came with overwhelming power, while demonstrating that strength without wisdom was merely destruction, waiting for excuse to reveal its true nature. The defeat he suffered was not just tactical, but existential, destroying assumptions about his own invincibility while forcing him to confront possibility that his power might be inadequate when it mattered most. But it was awakening that followed his near-death experience that truly changed everything, lying on ground with Toji's blade at his throat, while achieving perfect understanding of reverse curse technique that had eluded him throughout his training. The ability to heal himself was not just technical breakthrough, but fundamental evolution in his relationship with power, transforming him from someone who wielded strength into someone who embodied it completely, while understanding both its possibilities and limitations. The hollow technique that finally killed Toji demonstrated difference between natural talent and transcendent mastery, purple combining attractive force of blue with repulsive force of red to create pure destruction that eliminated not just opponent's body, but very space he had occupied. The victory was complete but hollow, achieved through methods that highlighted growing separation between his capabilities and human experiences that gave such capabilities meaning beyond mere demonstration of superior force. The year that followed Geto's defection was spent learning to live with failure and loss that could not be remedied through any application of power or technique, understanding that strongest sorcerer could not protect everyone who mattered to him, despite possessing abilities that approached divine authority over fundamental forces. The friendship that had sustained him through his student years was revealed as fundamentally fragile, destroyed by philosophical differences that no amount of shared experience could overcome when tested by circumstances that demanded impossible choices. The isolation that resulted from losing his closest companion was more complete than anything he had experienced during childhood, because it involved not just absence of understanding, but active rejection of everything he represented by person who had known him most intimately. The conversations they had shared about strength and responsibility had been revealed as inadequate preparation for moral complexities that real world presented when theoretical discussions were tested against practical necessities that admitted no perfect solutions. The teaching position he eventually accepted represented not career change but fundamental reimagining of how strength could be used to serve not just immediate needs of society but long-term development of individuals capable of wielding Beijali, power without being consumed by it. Understanding that his greatest contribution might come through nurturing others rather than attempting to solve every problem through direct application of overwhelming force that had proven insufficient for protecting what mattered most. The students who became his responsibility possessed not just exceptional abilities but complex personal histories that had shaped their understanding of power and responsibility in ways that reflected trauma and loss similar to his own experiences, but requiring different approaches to healing and development. Each carried burdens that might have crushed spirits less resilient, while demonstrating potential that could reshape Jujutsu world if properly nurtured and guided toward constructive expression rather than destructive release. The educational philosophy that emerged from his recognition of systematic problems within Jujutsu society emphasized collaborative problem-solving rather than individual achievement, emotional development rather than pure technical mastery, and long-term thinking about kind of society their actions were creating rather than short-term tactical considerations that prioritized immediate effectiveness over sustainable progress toward better future for everyone whose welfare depended on decisions made by those powerful enough to reshape reality according to their will. But it was sealed imprisonment within prison realm that provided his most profound education in powerlessness, forced confinement that stripped away every defense his abilities could provide while leaving him unable to protect people whose welfare had motivated his entire approach to strength and responsibility. The darkness that surrounded him was not merely absence of light but negation of possibility, state that eliminated not just movement but basic relationship between intention and action that defined conscious existence. The knowledge that time passed differently within his confinement meant that minutes of subjective experience might correspond to hours or days in external world where his students and colleagues faced challenges without access to strength that had maintained balances they had never fully appreciated until it was removed from circumstances that had seemed stable only because his presence had made them appear so. The guilt that accompanied this understanding was more painful than any torture his captors could have devised. Constant reminder that his failure had consequences extending far beyond personal suffering. The determination that gradually replaced initial despair was based on systematic analysis of what his imprisonment meant for broader struggle, while understanding that his eventual escape would be meaningful only if he could return to world where values he had fought to preserve retained enough influence to justify sacrifices that had been made to maintain them. The conviction that sustained him through darkest periods was grounded in knowledge accumulated through decades of observation and education. Understanding that human spirit possessed resilience that could survive and eventually overcome even most overwhelming expressions of supernatural malevolence. The liberation that eventually came was not triumph but transition, return to active service that revealed how thoroughly world had changed during his absence, while highlighting both capabilities and limitations that his experience with powerlessness had clarified in ways that might have been impossible to achieve through continued invincibility. The strongest sorcerer had learned that his greatest strength lay not in techniques but in capacity to guide others toward better choices than ones that had destroyed his most important friendship while protecting values that made such proking maces. Guidance meaningful rather than merely tactical. The final battle that would define his legacy was approached not with confidence based on superior ability, but with acceptance that came from understanding his life had achieved purposes for which it had been lived. Death, in service of others, representing not defeat, but completion of journey that had been shaped by power while being given meaning through connection to humanity, that such power existed to protect rather than dominate or abandon in pursuit of transcendent isolation that might eliminate vulnerability while destroying everything that made strength worth wielding. The young man who entered Tokyo Jujutsu High School in the autumn of 2005 carried within himself a philosophical framework built upon genuine desire to protect those who could not protect themselves, understanding that exceptional power created moral obligations that transcended personal comfort or individual ambition. Suguru Geto possessed the kind of natural charisma that drew people into his orbit without conscious effort. But more significantly, he carried conviction that strength existed to serve justice rather than to demonstrate superiority or achieve dominance over those whose circumstances had not blessed them with supernatural abilities. His curse manipulation technique, which allowed him to absorb and control malevolent spirits with unprecedented precision, reflected both his tactical sophistication and his fundamental belief that evil could be transformed into instrument of protection through proper understanding and disciplined application of power, guided by moral principle. The process of consuming curses was viscerally repugnant in ways that exceeded mere physical disgust, requiring him to internalize malevolence that had been distilled from human suffering while maintaining psychological barriers that prevented such contamination from affecting his essential character or corrupting his commitment to using strength in service of those who needed protection. The friendship that developed between him and Satoru Gojo during their first weeks at the institution was based on mutual recognition of intellectual equals, who could challenge each other's assumptions while sharing commitment to the Kaisen, ideals that elevated their profession beyond mere technical exercise towards something approaching sacred calling. Their conversations ranged across philosophical territories that most of their peers found either incomprehensible or irrelevant, exploring questions about power, responsibility, and the relationship between individual capability and collective welfare, with intensity that reflected their understanding that such questions would shape not just their personal development, but the future of everyone whose safety depended on decisions made by those strong enough to enforce their will upon reality. The dynamic that emerged between them was characterized by productive tension that pushed both toward deeper understanding of complex moral issues while providing intellectual stimulation that their isolated childhoods had denied them, despite educational opportunities that exceeded anything ordinary students could have accessed. Geto's philosophical sophistication complemented Satoru's technical brilliance, while his emotional maturity provided anchor for discussions that might otherwise have drifted toward abstract theorizing without practical application to circumstances that demanded concrete action rather than merely elegant analysis. The training regimen that occupied their days was designed to develop not just their supernatural abilities, but their capacity to deploy such abilities according to principles that served protection rather than destruction, understanding that power, without proper moral foundation, was preparation for catastrophe rather than service. The exercises that challenged their technical limits were always conducted within frameworks that emphasized responsibility toward those who would be affected by their choices, creating habits of thought that integrated tactical consideration with ethical reflection in ways that might prevent corruption that had claimed previous generations of exceptional sorcerers. The missions that provided real-world testing of their developing capabilities revealed both Geto's natural aptitude for strategic thinking and his growing discomfort with aspects of Jujutsu society that seemed to prioritize institutional maintenance, overprotection of innocent people who remained ignorant of supernatural forces that shaped their world in ways they could never understand. The bureaucratic procedures that constrained their responses to genuine threats appeared designed to minimize political complications rather than maximize effectiveness of interventions that could save lives, creating frustrations that accumulated over time while challenging his faith in systems he had initially trusted to provide moral guidance. The first significant crack in his philosophical foundation occurred during mission that brought him into extended contact with non-sorcerers, whose treatment of each other revealed depths of cruelty that seemed to exceed anything that cursed spirits could achieve through supernatural malevolence. The humans he was sworn to protect displayed capacity for inflicting suffering that appeared motiveless and systematic, suggesting that evil was not aberration requiring correction, but fundamental aspect of human nature that no amount of external protection could eliminate or modify through patient intervention. The curse users who had orchestrated the situation understood exactly how exposure to such revelations would affect someone whose idealism had not yet been tempered by sufficient experience with moral complexity that characterized most human interactions when stripped of social constraints that maintained facade of civilization. Their manipulation was subtle but systematic, designed to highlight contradictions between Ghetto's protective philosophy and evidence that suggested the people he sought to defend were often more malevolent than the supernatural threats he was trained to eliminate. But it was the Star Plasma Vessel mission that provided decisive test of his ability to maintain faith in humanity, despite exposure to circumstances that challenged every assumption he had developed about the relationship between strength and moral obligation. Riko Amanai's murder by non-sorcerers who celebrated her death with enthusiastic approval revealed not just individual evil, but collective rejection of sacrifice that had been made to ensure their continued safety from supernatural threats they were too ignorant to comprehend or appreciate. The sight of adults applauding the assassination of a 14-year-old girl whose only crime had been accepting cosmic responsibility that would have preserved their civilization from destruction beyond their capacity to imagine was perhaps more traumatic than witnessing her death itself. Understanding that the people he had dedicated his life to protecting were not merely ungrateful but actively hostile toward those who made sacrifices on their behalf. The cognitive dissonance created by this revelation was enormous, forcing him to reconsider fundamental assumptions about human nature while processing grief for someone whose courage had exceeded anything his own privileged existence had required him to demonstrate. The year that followed was characterized by gradual erosion of optimistic beliefs about human potential that had sustained him through previous challenges while providing him with motivation necessary to endure physical and psychological costs that came with regularly consuming manifestations of pure malevolence. The curse absorption that had once felt like noble sacrifice began to seem like contamination of his essential nature in service of people who not only failed to appreciate such sacrifice, but would actively oppose it if they possessed sufficient knowledge and power to interfere with protection they received. The philosophical discussions that had once energized his friendship with Satoru became sources of frustration as his perspective shifted toward conclusions that his closest companion could not accept or understand, creating intellectual and emotional distance that reflected fundamental disagreement about whether humanity was worthy of the sacrifices that protection required from those strong enough to provide it. The equality that had characterized their relationship was being undermined by Ghetto's growing conviction that strength created not just capability, but superiority that justified different moral standards for those who possessed exceptional abilities. The missions that continued throughout this period revealed systematic patterns of human cruelty and ingratitude that seemed to validate his evolving worldview, while providing additional evidence that non-sorcerers were not innocent, victims requiring protection but parasites whose existence prevented development of world where strength could flourish without moral constraints imposed by consideration for those too weak to survive in genuinely competitive environment. Each assignment brought new examples of behavior that exceeded cursed spirit malevolence, while being motivated by distinctly human capacities for self-deception and deliberate evil. The internal monologue that occupied his thoughts during quiet moments was increasingly dominated by analysis of why superior individuals should accept limitations imposed by concern for welfare of those whose contributions to civilization were negligible, while their capacity for creating problems that required intervention by their betters was seemingly infinite. The logical framework that emerged from such analysis was internally consistent but morally horrifying, reasoning that led inexorably toward conclusions that justified genocide as solution to problems that conventional approaches had failed to address adequately. The tipping point that completed his psychological transformation came during encounter with Village, where non-sorcerers had tortured and murdered 2 young girls whose only crime had been possessing supernatural abilities that frightened adults too ignorant to understand that such capabilities represented protection rather than threat. The systematic cruelty that had been inflicted over extended period was documented with photographic precision that revealed not momentary evil but calculated sadism that exceeded anything he had witnessed during years of fighting cursed spirits. The rage that filled him in response to this discovery was not the righteous anger that had motivated his previous interventions on behalf of innocent victims, but something colder and more systematic, hatred that encompassed not just perpetrators of specific atrocities, but entire category of beings whose existence seemed to require elimination if justice was to be achieved through means that transcended inadequate legal and social systems that had permitted such horrors to occur. The transformation from protector to destroyer was not sudden but inevitable, logical conclusion of reasoning that had been developing for years, while his faith in humanity eroded under pressure of accumulated evidence. The massacre that followed was conducted with methodical precision that reflected not loss of control, but deliberate application of superior power according to principles that prioritized justice over mercy, while eliminating threats to future development of world where strength could operate, without constraints imposed by concern for those whose survival depended entirely on protection they neither appreciated nor deserved. The techniques he employed were not elegant demonstrations of cursed energy manipulation, but efficient tools for achieving objectives that transcended conventional categories of right and wrong. The philosophical framework that justified his actions was sophisticated and comprehensive, addressing potential objections, while providing moral foundation for continued pursuit of goals that required systematic elimination of obstacles to creation of society where supernatural ability could develop without interference from those whose fear and ignorance prevented recognition of benefits that proper hierarchy could provide. The reasoning was compelling and internally consistent, lacking only emotional connection to victims that might have prevented complete surrender to logic that prioritized abstract principles over individual human suffering. The confrontation with Satoru that followed was perhaps more painful than any physical combat could have been, representing final dissolution of friendship that had provided meaning and companionship during years when such connection had seemed like foundation for everything else he valued in existence. The conversation they shared revealed how completely their worldviews had diverged, while highlighting impossibility of reconciliation between perspectives that had once seemed compatible, but had evolved in directions that made continued association impossible, without betrayal of essential convictions. The years that followed his departure from Tokyo Jujutsu High were spent building organization and acquiring resources necessary to implement solutions that conventional society would never accept voluntarily, understanding that meaningful change required power sufficient to overcome resistance from those who benefited from existing arrangements regardless of costs such arrangements imposed on others. The followers he attracted were drawn not just by his strength but by philosophical coherence that provided justification for actions that squeamish morality condemned, while practical necessity demanded. The techniques he developed during this period were focused not on elegant expression of supernatural ability, but on efficient achievement of objectives that served larger strategic goals. Understanding that his ultimate success would be measured not by aesthetic beauty of individual interventions, but by completeness of transformation he could achieve in a world that had been corrupted by compromise and false compassion that prevented necessary decisions from being implemented according to logic rather than sentiment. The psychological isolation that accompanied his new role was profound but voluntary, accepting loneliness as price for moral clarity that most people were too weak to achieve or maintain. When tested by circumstances that revealed fundamental contradictions between popular ethics and practical requirements for creating a better world. The connections he maintained with other curse users were tactical rather than emotional. Alliances based on shared objectives rather than genuine friendship or mutual understanding that transcended utilitarian consideration. But beneath strategic planning and philosophical justification, something essential had been lost during his transformation from idealistic student to pragmatic revolutionary. Capacity for love and connection that had once provided motivation for protection while making such protection meaningful rather than merely tactical. The person who had entered Tokyo Jujutsu High, seeking to serve justice, had been replaced by someone who understood justice as concept requiring implementation through means that eliminated rather than preserved what he had once valued most about human existence. The final confrontation with his former best friend was both inevitable and tragic, representing not just conflict between opposing forces but resolution of questions about whether strength could be maintained without sacrificing humanity. That gave such strength purpose beyond mere demonstration of superior capability. Their battle was conducted with technical precision that reflected years of development, while being motivated by philosophical differences that made compromise impossible, despite personal history that both wished could have provided foundation for different outcome. The death that concluded his journey was not defeat, but completion of transformation that had begun years earlier, when faith in humanity had been replaced by conviction that humanity required replacement through systematic application of superior power, guided by principles that transcended sentimental attachment to individuals whose suffering was regrettable, but necessary for achievement of goals that served greater good as he had come to understand it. The boy who had wanted to protect everyone had become man, who understood that protecting what was valuable required eliminating what was worthless. Logical progression that preserved essential commitment to justice while redefining justice according to standards that admitted no room for weakness or mercy that might compromise ultimate objectives. His legacy was not evil, but tragedy, demonstration of how philosophical sophistication and genuine moral concern could be corrupted by exposure to evidence that challenged optimistic assumptions about human nature while providing no adequate framework for processing such evidence. without abandoning either intellectual honesty or essential humanity that made moral reasoning meaningful, rather than merely academic exercise in logical consistency that served no purpose beyond its own elegant construction. The compound where Toji Fushiguro spent his childhood was a monument to power that celebrated strength while systematically destroying those who failed to meet standards that had been established by generations of ancestors who understood that weakness was not misfortune to be pitied, but contamination to be eliminated before it could spread to compromise the purity of bloodlines that had been carefully cultivated through centuries of strategic breeding and ruthless selection. The Zenin family's approach to child rearing was based on principles that prioritized utility over affection while treating individual worth as measurable quantity that could be assessed through objective evaluation of supernatural capabilities rather than sentimental consideration of personal qualities that served no tactical purpose. Toji's complete absence of cursed energy was not merely disappointment to his relatives, but existential threat to assumptions that had shaped their understanding of what it meant to be worthy of continued existence within hierarchies that had no place for those whose birth represented failure of genetic planning that should have been prevented through more careful selection of breeding partners. The child who possessed no supernatural abilities in family where such abilities defined individual value was treated not as unfortunate accident, but as evidence of fundamental flaw that required correction through methods that prioritized institutional welfare over individual comfort or psychological development. The abuse that characterized his early years was not motivated by sadistic pleasure, but by systematic application of pressure designed to force manifestation of abilities that might be dormant rather than absent. Understanding that family reputation depended on maintaining appearance, that their bloodline remained pure and powerful, despite evidence that suggested genetic deterioration had begun to affect their capacity to produce heirs worthy of ancestral legacy. The beatings and humiliation were conducted with clinical detachment that made them more psychologically damaging than emotional outbursts would have been, treating him as experimental subject rather than family member whose welfare mattered for reasons that transcended his potential utility. The psychological defense mechanisms that he developed in response to this treatment were based on systematic elimination of vulnerabilities that could be exploited by those who viewed his suffering as entertainment or educational opportunity for children who possessed the supernatural gifts he lacked. The emotional numbing that characterized his personality was not natural callousness, but learned response to circumstances that had taught him that feeling pain only made it more acute, while providing no tactical advantage that might help let him survive or escape conditions that were designed to break his spirit rather than develop his character. The physical training that occupied his adolescence was motivated not by family investment in his development, but by recognition that his unusual constitution might have practical applications that could serve clan interests despite his lack of traditional sorcerer capabilities. The strength and speed that he developed through relentless conditioning exceeded normal human parameters, while his complete absence of cursed energy made him invisible to supernatural perception that most sorcerers relied upon for detecting and evaluating threats during combat situations. But even these remarkable physical capabilities were viewed by his relatives as consolation prizes rather than genuine assets, useful for certain specialized applications, but fundamentally inferior to supernatural techniques that could manipulate reality according to principles that transcended ordinary physical limitations. The respect he earned through demonstration of combat effectiveness was grudging and conditional, acknowledging his utility while making clear that such utility could never compensate for his failure to inherit abilities that would have made him worthy of genuine acceptance within family hierarchies. The resentment that accumulated during these years of systematic rejection and abuse was not focused primarily on individuals who had implemented policies of exclusion and degradation, but on an entire system of values that prioritized supernatural ability over personal character while treating human worth as measurable commodity rather than inherent dignity that existed independent of capabilities or achievements. The hatred that grew within him encompassed not just family members who had tormented him, but broader Jujutsu society that had created conditions where such treatment was considered normal and appropriate. The escape that he eventually achieved was not carefully planned rebellion, but desperate flight from circumstances that had become psychologically unbearable, despite physical hardship that would have broken someone whose constitution had not been forged through years of systematic brutalization, designed to eliminate weakness through exposure to pressures that exceeded normal human capacity to endure. The departure was conducted without ceremony or explanation, understanding that family members who had never viewed him as genuine relative would not mourn his absence or attempt to retrieve someone whose presence had been tolerated rather than valued. The years that followed were characterized by systematic cultivation of abilities that could be monetized through applications that conventional society would condemn, while Jujutsu World would hire him to perform because his lack of cursed energy made him uniquely suited for eliminating targets that possessed supernatural defenses against ordinary assassination attempts. The reputation he built as sorcerer-killer was based not on sadistic pleasure in causing death, but on professional competence that delivered results that justified fees that allowed him to live according to his own terms rather than accepting employment that required submission to authority figures whose respect he could never earn regardless of his achievements. The weapons that became extensions of his personality were chosen for effectiveness rather than aesthetic beauty, tools designed to exploit weaknesses in supernatural defenses, while maximizing tactical advantages that came from fighting opponents who had never learned to defend against purely physical attacks, delivered with precision that exceeded their expectations about what non-sorcerers could achieve. Through training and determination alone, each cursed tool he acquired was selected for specific capabilities that addressed limitations he had identified through analysis of previous encounters rather than emotional attachment to particular fighting styles or traditional preferences. The isolation that characterized his adult life was both chosen and imposed, reflecting his preference for solitude that eliminated complications while acknowledging that relationships required vulnerabilities he could not afford to expose without compromising effectiveness that his survival depended upon in profession where mistakes typically resulted in death rather than merely professional embarrassment. The emotional distance he maintained from potential connections was protective mechanism rather than natural inclination, understanding that caring about others created weaknesses that enemies could exploit while providing no tactical advantages that might justify such risks. But the encounter that would temporarily transform his understanding of what human connection might offer came through meeting woman, whose acceptance of him was not based on his capabilities or potential utility, but on recognition of essential humanity that had survived, despite systematic efforts to eliminate qualities that served no practical purpose within frameworks that prioritized strength over compassion. The love that developed between them was perhaps the first genuine emotional connection he had experienced since childhood, representing possibility that intimacy might be achievable without creating vulnerabilities that would inevitably be exploited by those who viewed such connections as opportunities for manipulation or control. The marriage that followed was conducted with understanding that conventional domestic arrangements were impossible given his profession and psychological makeup, but the commitment they shared transcended legal formalities while providing foundation for a relationship that honored both his need for independence and her willingness to accept partnership with someone whose past had created damage that might never heal completely, but could be managed through patient understanding and mutual respect that asked no more than what could be given freely. The birth of his son represented unprecedented experience of responsibility that extended beyond immediate survival concerns toward long-term consideration of another person's welfare in ways that challenged everything he had learned about prioritizing self-interest over emotional investment, that created obligations he was poorly equipped to fulfill despite genuine desire to provide better foundation for child's development than he had received from his own family. The love he felt for Megumi was real but terrifying, creating vulnerabilities he had spent years learning to avoid while generating protective instincts that exceeded his understanding of how to nurture rather than merely defend. The period that followed was perhaps the closest he had ever come to experiencing normal human happiness. Domestic tranquility that provided respite from isolation, while creating sense of purpose that transcended professional achievement or personal survival towards something approaching genuine meaning that gave structure to existence beyond mere accumulation of resources or demonstration of superior capability. The routine that emerged around family life was simultaneously foreign and deeply satisfying, introducing him to pleasures he had never imagined possible, despite their ordinary nature that most people took for granted. But the death of his wife shattered this fragile foundation, while demonstrating how completely happiness depended on factors beyond individual control. Regardless of how carefully protective measures were implemented or how thoroughly potential threats were eliminated through preventive action. The loss was not just emotional but philosophical, destroying faith he had begun to develop in possibility that strength could be used to preserve rather than merely destroy, while creating security that extended beyond personal safety toward protection of what made life worth living, rather than merely survivable. The grief that followed was compounded by recognition that his son would now face challenges similar to those that had shaped his own development. Understanding that single parent with his psychological makeup and professional obligations was poorly equipped to provide nurturing that healthy child development required, while institutional alternatives available to him were all variations of systems that had demonstrated their capacity for creating damage rather than fostering growth. The weight of this responsibility was perhaps more overwhelming than any combat situation he had faced because it involved protecting someone else's future rather than merely his own survival. The decision to abandon Megumi was motivated not by lack of love, but by recognition that his presence in child's life would expose him to dangers that exceeded any benefits paternal protection might provide. Understanding that his profession and psychological limitations made him liability rather than asset in circumstances that required stability and emotional nurturing rather than tactical competence and physical protection. The abandonment was act of love disguised as cruelty, sacrifice that prioritized child's welfare over his own need for connection, despite psychological costs that such separation would inevitably impose. The return to professional killing that followed was conducted with mechanical efficiency that reflected systematic suppression of emotional responses that had proven too dangerous to maintain in profession where sentiment could prove fatal, while providing no tactical advantages that might justify such vulnerabilities. The jobs he accepted were selected for financial return rather than personal satisfaction, understanding that money was only resource that could provide his son with opportunities that his direct involvement could never offer due to complications that his presence would create. The years that followed were characterized by gradual deterioration of psychological barriers that had once protected him from fully comprehending moral implications of his choices. understanding that systematic killing for money was corrupting essential aspects of character that had survived family abuse and social rejection, but could not withstand prolonged exposure to violence that served no purpose beyond personal enrichment at cost of other people's lives. The numbness that had once been protective mechanism was becoming permanent feature of personality that eliminated capacity for experiencing satisfaction or meaning beyond temporary relief from pressures that accumulated faster than they could be resolved. The assignment that would prove to be his final mission was accepted through same pragmatic calculation that had governed his professional decisions for years, evaluation of risk versus reward, that failed to account for psychological factors that had been building toward crisis, that mere tactical analysis could not predict or prevent. The target was teenage girl, whose death would serve political purposes he neither understood nor cared about. Another elimination to be accomplished through methods that had proven reliable, despite growing sense that such reliability was becoming burden rather than asset. But the encounter with Satoru Gojo that followed demonstrated how thoroughly his capabilities had been compromised by years of avoiding emotional investment, while systematic killing had eroded foundations that had once made him formidable opponent capable of challenging even exceptionally powerful sorcerers through superior preparation and tactical intelligence. The defeat he suffered was comprehensive and final, representing not just failure of technique, but complete collapse of approach to existence that had prioritized survival over every other consideration, while remaining blind to costs that such prioritization had imposed. The resurrection that brought him back to limited existence revealed how completely death had changed his understanding of what his life had accomplished, and what it had cost those who had been affected by his choices. Understanding that abandonment of his son had been mistake that could not be remedied through any amount of retroactive regret or good intentions that came too late to influence outcomes that had already been determined by his previous decisions. The knowledge that Megumi had survived and even thrived despite his abandonment was simultaneously relief and additional guilt, proving that his fears about his negative influence had been accurate while highlighting opportunities for positive impact that his cowardice had prevented him from pursuing. The final moments of his restored existence were spent attempting to provide protection that might partially compensate for years of absence, while demonstrating love that had never been adequately expressed despite being genuine foundation for decisions that had appeared to contradict such feelings. The sacrifice he made was inadequate recompense for damage his choices had caused, but represented acknowledgement that parental responsibility extended beyond mere genetic connection toward active commitment to child's welfare that required personal cost rather than simply emotional distance. Disguised as protective consideration, Toji Fushiguro had been shaped by rejection that transformed love into liability and strength into isolation, creating individual whose capabilities exceeded most human achievement, while his capacity for healthy relationships remained permanently damaged by experiences that had taught him to view connection as weakness that enemies would inevitably exploit. His death was tragedy, not because it ended possibilities for redemption, but because it concluded existence that had been prevented from achieving potential that might have served protection rather than destruction. If circumstances had provided foundation for development that honored both strength and humanity rather than demanding choice between them. The office building where Nanami Kento spent 7 years of his adult life stood as monument to systematic extraction of human potential in service of profits that would be distributed among individuals whose primary qualification was inherited wealth rather than meaningful contribution to productivity that generated such returns. The fluorescent lights that illuminated his cubicle cast harsh glare over spreadsheets and reports that documented financial transactions whose complexity served primarily to obscure the fundamental simplicity of systems designed to transfer resources from those who created value to those who possessed sufficient capital to claim ownership of other people's labor through legal mechanisms that had been refined over generations to eliminate any pretense of fairness or reciprocity. The routine that governed his days was characterized by mechanical precision that reflected corporate efficiency rather than human fulfillment. Each task calibrated to maximize output while minimizing costs in ways that treated employees as resources to be optimized rather than individuals whose welfare mattered for reasons that transcended their utility to shareholders who would never know their names or appreciate their sacrifices. The meetings that punctuated his schedule were conducted according to protocols that prioritized appearance of productivity over actual accomplishment. Elaborate theater designed to justify salaries of managers whose primary skill was creating illusion of leadership while contributing nothing substantive to objectives they claimed to be advancing. The salary that compensated his participation in this system was adequate for maintaining comfortable lifestyle, but insufficient for achieving financial independence that would have provided freedom to pursue activities that might have offered genuine satisfaction rather than mere economic security. The apartment he rented with his earnings was well appointed but sterile, furnished with items selected for functionality rather than aesthetic pleasure or emotional significance, reflecting approach to material comfort that prioritized efficiency over beauty in ways that mirrored his professional environment's treatment of human resources. The colleagues who shared his workspace were trapped in similar circumstances, but had developed psychological adaptations that allowed them to find meaning within constraints that Nanami found increasingly suffocating as years accumulated, without providing evidence that his contributions were serving purposes that justified the time and energy they demanded from his existence. Their casual acceptance of mediocrity and systematic waste was perhaps more disturbing than deliberate malice would have been, representing collective surrender to circumstances that could be changed through concerted effort if sufficient people possessed courage to demand better conditions rather than accepting inadequate arrangements as inevitable features of adult responsibility. But it was the realization that his mathematical and analytical capabilities were being employed to facilitate transactions that actively harmed ordinary people, while enriching those who already possessed more resources than they could meaningfully utilize, that finally shattered whatever illusions he had maintained about the moral neutrality of his professional activities. The reports he prepared documented financial instruments that extracted wealth from communities while creating no corresponding value, elaborate schemes designed to circumvent regulations that had been established to prevent exactly the kind of exploitation his work was enabling. The existential crisis that followed this recognition was characterized not by dramatic emotional breakdown, but by gradual erosion of psychological barriers that had protected him from fully comprehending how completely his adult life had been devoted to serving purposes that contradicted everything he had been taught to value during his education and early development. The meaning that he had sought through professional achievement was revealed as illusion, constructed through self-deception that allowed participation in systems whose fundamental nature he had refused to acknowledge until evidence became too overwhelming to ignore. The decision to leave corporate employment was motivated not by clear vision of alternative career path, but by recognition that continued participation in work that served no constructive purpose would complete the psychological damage that had already begun to affect his capacity for experiencing satisfaction or maintaining hope that his existence could serve purposes worthy of the intelligence and dedication he possessed. The resignation he submitted was brief and professional, offering no explanation for his departure beyond standard language about pursuing other opportunities that provided no indication of the profound moral awakening that had precipitated his choice. The period that followed was characterized by systematic evaluation of career options that might provide income adequate for basic survival while serving purposes that aligned with values he had neglected during years of prioritizing financial security over ethical consideration of how his capabilities were being deployed. The analysis he conducted was methodical and comprehensive, examining various fields that might benefit from his analytical skills while contributing to human welfare rather than merely facilitating wealth extraction that served no productive function. The advertisement that led him back to Tokyo Jujutsu High was encountered during research into educational opportunities that might provide foundation for career transition toward work that served constructive rather than exploitative purposes, understanding that his mathematical background might be applicable to supernatural phenomena that operated according to principles that conventional science had not yet developed adequate frameworks to analyze effectively. The description of Jujutsu sorcery as profession, dedicated to protecting innocent people from threats they could not comprehend or defend against themselves, resonated with his desire to find meaningful application for capabilities that had been wasted in service of objectives he had come to. This bise. The interview process that preceded his acceptance into the program revealed both his intellectual qualifications for understanding complex theoretical principles and his psychological suitability for work that required courage to face dangers that exceeded normal human experience, while maintaining emotional stability necessary for making life and death decisions under pressure that would overwhelm individuals whose personalities had not been shaped by exposure to systematic disappointment and moral compromise. His corporate experience had prepared him for jujutsu work in ways that conventional education could never have achieved, providing him with realistic expectations about institutional dysfunction, while eliminating naive optimism that might have made adaptation to supernatural violence psychologically impossible. The training that followed was simultaneously more demanding and more satisfying than anything he had experienced during his previous career. Physical conditioning and technique development that pushed his capabilities toward limits he had never tested, while providing clear evidence that his efforts were serving purposes that justified whatever personal costs they might require. The cursed energy manipulation that he learned to control was not mere academic exercise, but practical skill that would enable him to protect people whose welfare mattered for reasons that transcended their economic utility or potential contribution to his personal advancement. The philosophical discussions that were integrated into technical instruction provided intellectual framework that had been completely absent from corporate training programs. Exploration of moral questions that had real consequences for people whose lives would be affected by decisions made in circumstances that admitted no perfect solutions, but demanded choice between alternatives that varied in their ethical implications and practical effectiveness. The conversations with instructors and fellow students challenged assumptions he had developed about the relationship between individual capability and social responsibility, while providing models for thinking about power that transcended mere accumulation of resources or demonstration of technical competence. The first mission that tested his developing abilities in real-world circumstances was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating, confronting cursed spirit whose malevolence exceeded anything his imagination had been capable of constructing, while demonstrating that his training had provided him with tools adequate for eliminating threats that would have been impossible to address through conventional methods. The victory he achieved was modest but genuine, evidence that his transition from corporate drone to active protector was succeeding despite challenges that had initially seemed insurmountable. But the psychological impact of witnessing supernatural evil firsthand was more profound than any preparation could have provided. Understanding that cursed spirits were not mere phenomena to be analyzed and categorized, but manifestations of human suffering that had been transformed into predatory entities whose existence required elimination rather than study or negotiation. The violence that he was forced to employ was not an optional component of his new profession, but an essential aspect of work that served protection through methods that academic analysis could describe, but never adequately prepare him to implement without personal cost. The cases that followed during his first year as active sorcerer revealed systematic patterns of institutional neglect and bureaucratic incompetence that exceeded even his corporate experience in their capacity for transforming necessary work into exercises in frustration that wasted resources, while failing to address problems they were ostensibly designed to solve. The administrators who governed Jujutsu society possessed no better understanding of how to balance competing priorities than their counterparts in private industry, making decisions based on political considerations rather than tactical effectiveness or moral imperative to protect innocent people from threats that exceeded their capacity to comprehend. The partnership with Yuhaibara that provided his most satisfying professional relationship was based on mutual recognition of individuals who had chosen Jujutsu work for reasons that transcended personal advancement or institutional loyalty. Understanding that their shared commitment to protecting others created bond that could sustain them through challenges that would have broken partnerships based on mere tactical convenience or social compatibility. The younger sorcerer's optimism complemented Nanami's analytical approach, while his genuine enthusiasm for their shared mission provided emotional balance that prevented cynicism from undermining effectiveness that their work required. The conversations they shared during missions and training revealed both the intellectual sophistication that had attracted Nanami to Jujutsu work and the emotional rewards that had been completely absent from his corporate experience. Discussions about technique and strategy that served practical purposes, while exploring philosophical questions about duty and sacrifice that gave meaning to activities that might otherwise have seemed like elaborate exercise in violence. Management. Their friendship was professional and personal simultaneously, reflecting recognition that effective partnership required understanding that extended beyond tactical coordination toward genuine care for each other's welfare and development. But it was Haibara's death during mission that should have been routine assignment that shattered whatever illusions Nanami had maintained about the possibility of finding work that served meaningful purposes without demanding costs, that exceeded any benefits such work might provide to those who performed it. The younger man's body had been returned to headquarters in condition that made identification difficult, while his death had served no constructive purpose beyond providing evidence that their profession was inherently tragic. Regardless of how carefully preparation was conducted or how thoroughly risks were analyzed before deployment, the funeral that followed was conducted with ceremonial dignity that failed to address fundamental questions about whether institutional systems that regularly produced such outcomes could be justified through appeals to greater good that remained abstract, while individual losses were concrete and irreversible. The speeches that commemorated Haibara's service emphasized his dedication and courage, while remaining silent about administrative failures that had contributed to his death through inadequate support and unrealistic expectations about what individual sorcerers could accomplish without proper resources or tactical intelligence. The psychological aftermath of this loss was characterized by return of existential doubts that Nanami had hoped his career transition would resolve, understanding that Jujutsu work was subject to same kinds of systematic dysfunction that had made corporate employment unbearable, while adding physical dangers that could result in death rather than merely spiritual emptiness. The meaning he had sought through service to others was being undermined by recognition that such service was being conducted within institutional frameworks that prioritized political considerations over effective protection of people, whose welfare provided justification for entire system. The decision to continue working as Jujutsu sorcerer, despite these doubts, was motivated not by renewed faith in institutional effectiveness, but by recognition that abandoning the profession would mean accepting that Haibara's death had served no purpose whatsoever, while his own search for meaningful work had been revealed as naive fantasy that ignored fundamental realities about how power was exercised in any organized system. The alternative to flawed service was no service at all, creating moral equation that admitted no perfect solutions but demanded choice between inadequate options that varied only in their specific forms of compromise and limitation. The approach he developed for managing these contradictions was based on systematic compartmentalization that allowed him to fulfill professional obligations with competence and dedication while maintaining emotional distance from institutional politics that had proven immune to reform efforts by individuals whose influence was insufficient to challenge established procedures. The work he performed was excellent within constraints he could not change, serving protection of innocent people despite rather than because of systems that governed how such protection was organized and implemented. The students who eventually became his responsibility represented both hope for improvement that future generations might achieve, and reminder of costs that such improvement would demand from young people whose idealism had not yet been tempered by exposure to institutional realities that would inevitably disappoint their expectations about what individual effort could accomplish within frameworks designed to maintain stability rather than pursue excellence. Their enthusiasm was simultaneously inspiring and heartbreaking, reflecting optimism that he envied, while understanding that such optimism was unsustainable when tested by circumstances that had shaped his own more pessimistic worldview. The mentorship he provided was focused on practical skills and tactical knowledge that would keep them alive long enough to develop wisdom necessary for navigating moral complexities that their education had not adequately prepared them to address, understanding that survival was prerequisite for everything else they might hope to accomplish through their service. The philosophical discussions he avoided were not irrelevant, but dangerous, potentially undermining psychological barriers that protected them from becoming overwhelmed by recognition of how little individual effort could achieve against problems whose scope exceeded any realistic assessment of what their generation could accomplish. The missions that he supervised during their development were carefully selected to provide meaningful challenges while avoiding exposure to situations that might prove psychologically devastating before they had developed emotional resources necessary for processing experiences that would inevitably accumulate as their careers progressed. The balance between protection and preparation was delicate, requiring constant adjustment based on assessment of their individual psychological makeup and readiness for increasingly complex moral challenges that adult participation in Jujutsu world would eventually demand. But it was the Shibuya incident that provided ultimate test of everything he had learned about duty and sacrifice during years of trying to find meaningful application for capabilities that had been wasted in corporate service understanding that the crisis represented exactly the kind of circumstance where individual choice could influence outcomes that affected thousands of innocent people whose welfare depended on decisions made by those with sufficient courage to act, despite awareness that such action would likely result in personal destruction. The assignment he accepted was essentially suicide mission, disguised as tactical operation, requiring him to confront overwhelming supernatural forces with resources that were adequate for normal missions, but insufficient for circumstances that exceeded every previous challenge he had faced. The battle that followed was conducted with professional competence that reflected years of training and experience, while being motivated by acceptance that his survival was less important than successful completion of objectives that served protection of others. Understanding that meaningful death was preferable to meaningless survival that preserved his existence while failing to justify choices he had made throughout his adult life. The techniques he deployed were not elegant demonstrations of supernatural ability, but efficient tools for achieving tactical goals that transcended personal safety, while requiring complete commitment that admitted no reservation or hesitation. The injuries he sustained were severe but acceptable given strategic importance of his mission. Understanding that physical damage was temporary compared to psychological damage that would result from failure to fulfill responsibilities he had accepted when he chose to become Jujutsu sorcerer rather than remaining civilian whose welfare was someone else's obligation. The pain he experienced was real but irrelevant. Distraction from more important considerations about whether his actions were serving purposes that validated costs they imposed on himself and others who cared about his welfare. The final moments of his existence were characterized by satisfaction that had eluded him throughout most of his adult life. Recognition that his death was serving protection of people whose continued safety provided meaning that his corporate career had never offered, despite years of seeking purpose through professional achievement. The work he had performed had been flawed and incomplete, conducted within systems that were inadequate for challenges they were designed to address, but it had been genuine service to others, rather than elaborate self-deception that disguised exploitation as productivity. Nanami Kento had spent his adult life searching for work that justified time and energy it demanded from his existence, discovering through trial and error that meaningful employment required acceptance of imperfection, while remaining committed to serving purposes that transcended personal comfort or advancement. His death was tragedy not because it ended possibilities for future achievement, but because it concluded existence that had finally found balance between individual capability and collective welfare, demonstrating that adult responsibility meant choosing service despite systematic failures that made such service more difficult than it should have been in properly organized society. The compound where Maki Zenin spent her formative years was designed according to architectural principles that reflected the family's understanding of power as hierarchy made manifest in physical form. Every corridor and chamber arranged to reinforce distinctions between those who possessed sufficient cursed energy to matter and those whose birth had marked them as disappointments, requiring constant reminder of their inadequacy. The traditional buildings that housed generations of accomplished sorcerers stood as monuments to genetic superiority that had been carefully cultivated through centuries of strategic breeding, their elegant proportions and expensive materials serving as daily evidence of what strength could achieve when properly developed and deployed, according to principles that prioritized excellence over sentiment. The training grounds where she spent countless hours attempting to compensate for supernatural deficiencies through physical conditioning were situated in locations that provided maximum visibility to family members whose casual observations served as ongoing evaluation of her worthiness to continue occupying space that might have been better utilized by relatives whose inherited abilities justified their existence within hierarchies that had no patience for those who could not contribute meaningfully to collective power. The wooden posts and practice dummies that absorbed her frustrated attacks bore witness to determination that exceeded normal human parameters while remaining fundamentally inadequate for bridging gaps that biology had created between her potential and the expectations that defined acceptable performance within her family's value system. The weapons that became extensions of her personality were selected not for aesthetic beauty or traditional significance, but for practical effectiveness in circumstances where supernatural techniques would provide no assistance. Understanding that her survival depended entirely on mastery of conventional combat skills, that most sorcerers dismissed as primitive throwbacks to eras before cursed energy manipulation had been refined into art form that transcended mere physical capability. Each blade and staff she learned to wield represented acknowledgement that she would never possess abilities that came naturally to even the least talented members of her generation, forcing her to achieve, through discipline and determination, what others inherited as birthright. The psychological armor that she constructed around her emotions was designed to protect against constant exposure to contempt and dismissal that characterized every interaction with relatives who viewed her presence as embarrassing, reminder of genetic failure that reflected poorly on family reputation, while serving no constructive purpose that might have justified tolerance for someone whose deficiencies were apparent to anyone capable of perceiving cursed energy flow. The aggressive confidence that became her trademark was simultaneously authentic expression of her refusal to accept limitation and defensive mechanism that prevented others from recognizing vulnerabilities that might have been exploited by those who viewed her struggles as entertainment rather than evidence of remarkable determination. But it was her relationship with Mai that provided both greatest source of emotional support and most complex form of psychological torment. Understanding that their twinship created bonds that transcended normal sibling dynamics, while highlighting differences in capability that served as constant reminder of how completely biological lottery had determined their respective fates within family systems that treated individual worth as measurable quantity rather than inherent dignity that existed independent of supernatural achievement. The love that connected them was real but poisoned by awareness that their very existence created problems for each other that could not be resolved through mutual affection or shared determination to overcome circumstances that had been established before their birth. The conversations they shared during private moments were characterized by a mixture of genuine intimacy and careful emotional distance that protected both from acknowledging how thoroughly their family's treatment had damaged their capacity for healthy relationship, while creating dependencies that served neither of their individual development needs. Mai's fear of change that might worsen their already precarious position within clan hierarchy conflicted with Maki's determination to prove that strength could be achieved through means other than inherited cursed energy, creating tension that neither could resolve without betraying essential aspects of their personality that had been shaped by shared trauma and divergent responses to impossible circumstances. The decision to leave the Zenin compound was motivated not by clear vision of alternative life path, but by recognition that continued residence within environment that systematically undermined her psychological stability while providing no opportunities for meaningful development would eventually destroy whatever remained of her individual identity beneath layers of defensive mechanisms that had been necessary for survival but were becoming obstacles to growth that required different kinds of courage and determination. The departure was conducted without ceremony or family blessing, understanding that relatives who had never viewed her as genuine member would not mourn her absence or attempt to retrieve someone whose presence had been tolerated rather than valued. The enrollment at Tokyo Jujutsu High represented opportunity to test whether her physical capabilities could be developed to levels that might compensate for supernatural deficiencies, while providing an environment where individual worth was measured through broader criteria than simple assessment of inherited cursed energy levels. The institution's willingness to accept students whose backgrounds included unconventional approaches to sorcery suggested possibility that her unique combination of skills might find application that served constructive purposes, rather than merely providing evidence of determination that impressed no one, while changing nothing fundamental about her circumstances. The training regimen that she developed in collaboration with instructors who understood both her limitations and potential was focused on maximizing advantages that came from approaching combat through conventional weapons mastery while minimizing disadvantages that resulted from inability to deploy supernatural techniques that most sorcerers relied upon for both offensive and defensive applications. The exercises that pushed her physical capabilities towards superhuman levels were supplemented by tactical instruction that emphasized precision, timing, and strategic thinking over raw power applications that would remain forever beyond her reach. The cursed tools that eventually became integral to her fighting style represented compromise between her desire for self-reliance and practical recognition that some supernatural assistance would be necessary for survival, profession, where ordinary weapons were inadequate for addressing threats that operated according to principles beyond normal physical laws. The process of learning to integrate these artifacts into her combat repertoire required systematic suppression of pride that might have prevented her from accepting help she needed, while maintaining sense of individual achievement that gave meaning to capabilities she was developing through personal effort rather than inherited blessing. The relationships that she formed with classmates were constrained by emotional barriers that had been constructed during years of learning that genuine vulnerability could be exploited by those who viewed her struggles as weakness rather than strength, creating connections that were tactically effective but emotionally limited in ways that prevented formation of bonds that might have provided healing for wounds that accumulated during her development within family environment that had systematically undermined her confidence while failing to provide adequate support for psychological challenges that her circumstances created. The missions that tested her developing capabilities in real-world circumstances revealed both natural aptitude for combat applications of conventional skills and profound satisfaction that came from discovering that her approach to conflict could be effective despite lacking supernatural techniques that other sorcerers considered essential for professional competence. The victories she achieved were modest but genuine, evidence that determination could overcome disadvantages that had initially seemed insurmountable while providing foundation for confidence that had been systematically undermined throughout her formative years. But it was her growing understanding of how thoroughly her family's treatment had affected not just her individual development but her relationship with Mai that created most complex psychological challenges during this period of apparent progress and external validation. The guilt that accompanied her success was compounded by knowledge that her departure had left her sister alone within an environment that had become more hostile due to associations that her rebellion had created. Understanding that individual liberation had been achieved at cost of abandoning someone whose welfare mattered more than her own advancement or personal satisfaction. The conversations they maintained through carefully managed communication revealed both Mai's genuine pride in her achievements and underlying resentment about abandonment that had forced her to face family disapproval without support that their partnership had previously provided. The love that persisted between them was complicated by awareness that their different responses to shared trauma had created incompatible approaches to survival that made continued closeness impossible without one sacrificing essential aspects of identity that had been developed through years of individual struggle against circumstances that admitted no perfect solutions. The philosophical framework that emerged from these experiences was focused on questions about individual responsibility versus collective obligation, understanding that personal growth sometimes required choices that harmed others while remaining committed to values that made such choices meaningful rather than merely selfish. The tension between loyalty to those who shared her background and commitment to developing capabilities that might eventually enable her to challenge systems that had created their shared suffering was a constant source of internal conflict that no amount of external success could resolve definitively. The incident that would transform everything began as routine assignment that should have provided straightforward opportunity for demonstrating competence while contributing to team objectives that aligned with her personal goals for continued development and institutional acceptance. The circumstances that developed exceeded every preparation while revealing capabilities she had not known she possessed, alongside costs she had not anticipated having to pay for accessing power that remained fundamentally different from inherited techniques that defined normal sorcerer development. The awakening that followed her sister's sacrifice was accompanied by physical and psychological changes that exceeded anything her training had prepared her to process. Understanding that Mai's final gift had been transformation, that eliminated limitations she had struggled against throughout her entire existence, while creating new forms of power that operated according to principles she did not understand but could not deny, were reshaping every aspect of her identity and capability. The strength that flowed through her enhanced physique was intoxicating and terrifying simultaneously, representing achievement of goals she had pursued for years while arriving through means that made victory feel more like loss than triumph. The massacre that she conducted in response to her clan's treatment was motivated not by calculated revenge, but by systematic application of newly acquired capabilities against targets whose elimination served justice, while demonstrating how completely her understanding of power and responsibility had been altered by experiences that transcended normal categories of personal development or professional advancement. The techniques she employed were efficient rather than elegant, designed to achieve complete destruction of systems that had created conditions requiring such extreme responses, while ensuring that similar situations could not arise in future generations. The psychological aftermath of these events was characterized by forms of guilt and satisfaction that operated simultaneously without resolving into coherent emotional response that might have provided clear guidance for processing trauma that exceeded anything her previous experiences had prepared her to understand or integrate into stable sense of identity. The person who had entered the compound seeking confrontation with family members who had rejected her was not the same person who emerged from systematic elimination of people whose deaths had been necessary but not satisfying in ways she had anticipated. The conversations with surviving classmates that followed revealed both their fear of what she had become and their recognition that her transformation had been necessary for eliminating threats that would have continued affecting other young people whose circumstances might have led to similar Desperation. If institutional changes were not implemented to prevent repetition of patterns that had created her family's abusive dynamics, the isolation that resulted was familiar but newly painful. Understanding that power she had sought as solution to rejection had created different forms of separation that might prove even more difficult to overcome. The understanding that her strength had come through Mai's sacrifice rather than her own achievement created complex emotional responses that challenged every assumption she had developed about individual worth and collective responsibility. Understanding that her sister's death had been both gift and burden that could not be repaid through any future accomplishment, while remaining obligation that would shape every decision she made about how to deploy capabilities that had been purchased at cost she would never have chosen to pay if alternatives had been available. The work that she performed in aftermath of these revelations was motivated by recognition that her transformation imposed obligations that transcended personal preferences, while providing opportunities to prevent other young people from experiencing similar forms of systematic abuse and rejection that had characterized her own development within institutional frameworks that prioritized genetic inheritance over individual character or potential for growth through alternative means. The protection she could provide was limited but genuine, evidence that strength could serve constructive purposes, despite originating through processes that involved destruction of everything she had previously understood about herself and her relationship to others. The legacy that would define her impact was not the power she had achieved or the enemies she had defeated, but the example she provided of someone who had refused to accept limitation while remaining committed to values that transcended personal advancement, demonstrating that individual transformation was possible, even under circumstances that seemed to offer no hope for meaningful change or development. Maki Zenin had been shaped by rejection and systematic abuse, but she had not been destroyed by such experiences, finding instead ways to transform trauma into strength that served protection of others, while honoring memory of someone whose sacrifice had made such transformation possible. Despite costs that could never be fully repaid or adequately commemorated through conventional expressions of gratitude or remembrance, the room where Mai Zenin spent her childhood was located in the servants' quarters of the family compound, a deliberate architectural choice that reinforced her position within hierarchies that measured individual worth through supernatural capability, while treating those who possessed insufficient cursed energy as burdens whose existence required justification through service to relatives whose genetic lottery had blessed them with abilities that defined their value within systems designed to perpetuate inequality across generations. The small space she shared with Maki was furnished with items that had been deemed adequate for children whose prospects did not warrant investment in comfort or beauty, hand-me-down furniture, and worn textiles that served as daily reminders of their peripheral status within family structures that prioritize bloodline purity over individual character or potential for growth through unconventional means. The training sessions that occupied her mornings were conducted with the perfunctory attention that instructors reserved for students whose development was viewed as charitable obligation rather than meaningful investment in future clan strength. Understanding that her modest, cursed energy reserves would never support techniques sophisticated enough to justify serious pedagogical effort or resource allocation. The exercises she performed were simplified versions of curricula designed for more promising relatives, modified to account for limitations that made advanced instruction pointless, while providing enough basic competence to prevent complete embarrassment during formal evaluations that measured family educational standards. The weapon she eventually mastered was selected not for its potential to complement her natural abilities, but for its simplicity and reliability in hands of someone whose supernatural talents were insufficient for supporting complex, cursed tools that required substantial energy investment to function effectively. The revolver that became extension of her personality was crude by Zenin standards, but practical for applications that demanded precision rather than overwhelming power. Understanding that her survival would depend entirely on efficient deployment of limited resources, rather than spectacular demonstrations of inherited capability that remained forever beyond her reach. But it was her relationship with Maki that provided both greatest source of emotional sustenance and most acute form of psychological torment during formative years, when their shared circumstances created bonds that transcended normal sibling dynamics while highlighting differences in temperament that would eventually drive them toward incompatible responses to family rejection that neither could modify without betraying essential aspects of identity that had been shaped by trauma too fundamental to overcome through conscious effort or mutual support. The love that connected them was real, but complicated by awareness that their twinship created problems for each other, that individual action could not resolve, while collective resistance seemed impossible given their respective capabilities and psychological makeup. The conversations they shared during private moments revealed both genuine intimacy and careful emotional manipulation that protected Mai from having to confront her own fears about change, while encouraging Maki's growing determination to challenge family systems through methods that would inevitably destroy whatever fragile stability their current arrangement provided, despite its obvious inadequacies and inherent cruelties. The dependency that characterized their relationship was mutual, but unequal. Mai's need for security conflicting with Maki's drive toward independence in ways that created tension. Neither could resolve without sacrificing fundamental aspects of personality that made such resolution impossible. The psychological framework that Mai developed for processing family treatment was based on acceptance rather than resistance, understanding that her survival depended on finding ways to exist within systems that had not been designed to accommodate someone whose abilities were marginal, while her ambitions were essentially non-existent beyond basic desire to avoid additional suffering that rebellion might provoke from relatives who possessed power to make her circumstances even worse than they already were. The philosophy that emerged from this analysis was sophisticated in its fatalism, acknowledging injustice while refusing to pursue remedies that might worsen conditions for herself or her sister whose welfare mattered more than abstract principles about fairness or dignity. The academic education that supplemented her jujutsu training was conducted according to standards that reflected family expectations about her likely future role within clan hierarchy. Emphasis placed on domestic skills and administrative competence rather than theoretical knowledge or leadership development that would have been wasted on someone whose cursed energy levels precluded advancement to positions where such capabilities might prove useful. The curriculum was practical and limiting, designed to prepare her for support functions rather than independent decision-making, while ensuring that her education would not create aspirations that exceeded realistic assessment of what someone with her limitations could achieve within existing institutional structures. The social dynamics that characterized her interactions with more talented relatives were governed by protocols that had been established through generations of practice in managing relationships between clan members whose genetic advantages created natural hierarchies that could not be challenged, without undermining fundamental assumptions that maintained family cohesion and effectiveness. The deference she learned to display was not mere politeness, but survival strategy that prevented conflicts she could not win, while preserving whatever small privileges her birth had provided, despite her obvious inadequacies. The first serious challenge to her adaptive philosophy came when Maki announced her intention to leave the compound and pursue independent development at Tokyo Jujutsu High, decision that represented not just personal choice, but implicit rejection of everything that Mai had accepted as necessary. Compromise with circumstances that could not be changed through individual effort, regardless of how much determination or courage such effort might demonstrate. The conversation that followed this announcement revealed depths of fear that Mai had never fully acknowledged even to herself. Understanding that her sister's departure would leave her completely isolated within an environment that had been barely tolerable when shared with someone who understood her struggles. The arguments she presented against Maki's plans were ostensibly logical, but fundamentally emotional, appeals to practical considerations that disguised desperate need for maintaining relationship that had provided meaning and purpose during years when family treatment had systematically undermined her confidence while offering no alternatives that might have supported psychological development necessary for independent existence. The manipulation she attempted was conscious but justified through reasoning that prioritized their mutual welfare over individual growth that might destroy bonds neither could replace through other connections. But Maki's refusal to modify her plans forced Mai to confront possibility that her adaptive strategies had been based on false assumptions about what compromise could achieve when tested by circumstances that demanded real choice between security and growth. Understanding that her sister's courage was highlighting her own cowardice in ways that could not be rationalized through appeals to practical wisdom or superior understanding of family dynamics that made resistance futile regardless of how justified such resistance might appear from moral perspective that ignored tactical realities. The period that followed Maki's departure was characterized by psychological isolation that exceeded anything Mai had previously experienced. Understanding that her sister's absence had eliminated not just emotional support but tactical alliance that had provided protection against family members, who now viewed her as sole representative of genetic failure that reflected poorly on clan reputation, while serving no constructive purpose that might have justified continued tolerance for someone whose presence reminded everyone of standards they might fail to meet if genetics proved unreliable. The increased scrutiny and criticism that resulted from this changed status was accompanied by subtle but systematic pressure to demonstrate value that might compensate for associations that her relationship with Maki had created. Understanding that family members who had previously ignored her were now evaluating whether she possessed sufficient loyalty and competence to warrant continued residence within compound that could be better utilized by relatives whose prospects justified investment in their development and comfort. The work that she performed during this period was characterized by desperate efficiency that sought to prove her utility while avoiding any behavior that might be interpreted as preparation for following Maki's example of abandoning family obligations in pursuit of individual advancement that served no collective purposes. The domestic responsibilities she accepted were performed with meticulous attention to detail that reflected not pride in accomplishment, but fear of providing excuses for criticism that might escalate into pressure for departure. She was psychologically unprepared to handle without support systems that her sister's rebellion had eliminated. The letters that she received from Maki during this period provided updates about life at Tokyo Jujutsu High that were simultaneously reassuring and disturbing, evidence that her sister was finding success and satisfaction that validated decisions Mai had opposed, while highlighting possibilities that her own choices had foreclosed through commitment to security that was beginning to feel more like prison than protection. The pride she felt in Maki's achievements was complicated by resentment about abandonment that had forced her to face family disapproval without partnership that their relationship had previously provided. The conversations they managed to maintain through carefully scheduled communications revealed growing distance that reflected not just physical separation, but divergent life experiences that were creating incompatible perspectives about what strength meant and how it could be developed under circumstances that admitted no perfect solutions. Mai's continued emphasis on survival and adaptation conflicted with Maki's growing confidence about possibilities for individual transformation that seemed to ignore costs such transformation imposed on those left behind to manage consequences of choices they had not participated in making. The philosophical differences that emerged from these exchanges were focused on questions about loyalty versus ambition, understanding that Maki's success was creating pressure for Mai to pursue similar paths despite her recognition that such pursuit would require psychological resources she did not possess, while demanding courage that her personality had been shaped to avoid. Through years of learning that confrontation typically resulted in defeat rather than meaningful change or growth. But it was the emergence of circumstances that threatened both their lives that forced Mai to confront limitations that her adaptive philosophy had created, while revealing capabilities she had not known she possessed alongside costs she had not anticipated, having to pay for accessing power that operated according to principles she had spent years avoiding through conscious choice rather than incapacity. The crisis that developed around their family's treatment escalated beyond anything their previous experiences had prepared them to handle, requiring responses that exceeded both their individual capabilities and their capacity for collaboration that had been undermined by years of separation and divergent development. The realization that Maki's transformation would require sacrifice that only Mai could provide created moral dilemma that challenged every assumption she had developed about self-preservation versus collective welfare. Understanding that her sister's achievement of goals they had once shared would demand her own destruction, while serving purposes that transcended individual survival to encompass broader questions about justice and institutional change that their personal struggles had come to represent. Despite their private nature, the choice she made during that final confrontation was motivated not by sudden courage or philosophical awakening, but by recognition that love sometimes required sacrifice that admitted no alternative, while serving purposes that gave meaning to existence that had been characterized by systematic limitation and compromise that preserved life, while eliminating reasons that made such preservation worthwhile. The gift she offered was purchased through complete surrender of individual future, while providing Maki with capabilities that could serve protection and justice in ways that her own survival could never have achieved. The technique she employed to facilitate this transformation was crude by family standards, but effective for purposes that required emotional resonance rather than technical sophistication. Understanding that her cursed energy had always been intended for support rather than independent action, while remaining adequate for final contribution that honored their shared history, despite fundamental differences in how they had chosen to respond to circumstances that had shaped both their personalities and their relationship with each other and their broader social context. The words she spoke during this process were carefully chosen to provide guidance that might help Maki avoid psychological damage that could result from possessing power that had been purchased through means that challenged every assumption about individual worth and collective responsibility. Understanding that her sister's strength would need to be tempered by wisdom that prevented corruption, while maintaining essential humanity that made such strength meaningful rather than merely destructive. The vision she shared of future possibilities was based not on naive optimism, but on realistic assessment of what someone with Maki's enhanced capabilities might achieve when deployed according to principles that honored both individual development and collective welfare. Understanding that her sacrifice would serve purposes that extended beyond personal vengeance towards systematic elimination of conditions that had created their shared suffering, while preventing similar circumstances from affecting future generations whose development might follow different patterns. If institutional changes were implemented through methods that exceeded individual capacity but remained within reach of enhanced abilities that her gift had made possible. The peace that accompanied her final moments was characterized by satisfaction that had eluded her throughout most of her existence. Understanding that her death was serving protection and advancement of someone whose welfare had mattered more than her own survival, while contributing to changes that might prevent other young people from experiencing systematic abuse and rejection that had defined their formative years within. Family structures that treated individual worth as measurable commodity rather than inherent dignity that existed independent of genetic inheritance or supernatural capability. Mai Zenin had lived her entire existence in shadow of sister, whose courage and determination had exceeded her own capacity for risk-taking, while her final act demonstrated that love could transcend fear when circumstances demanded, sacrifice that served purposes larger than individual comfort or security, understanding that some gifts required complete surrender of self, while creating possibilities that justified costs they imposed on those brave enough to pay them in service of others whose potential could only be realized through support that exceeded normal expectations about what loyalty could demand or provide when tested by circumstances that admitted no compromise between competing values that defined what made existence meaningful rather than merely survivable. The elementary school where 6-year-old Yuta Okotsu first encountered the girl who would define both his capacity for love and his understanding of loss was the kind of institution where childhood friendships formed through proximity and calm shared experience rather than careful selection based on compatibility or mutual interest. Playground relationships that emerged from circumstances beyond individual control while creating bonds that would prove more durable than anyone could have predicted when measured against forces that typically dissolved such connections through natural processes of growth and change. The classroom where he sat during those early years was filled with children whose names he would eventually forget, but Rika Orimoto occupied the desk beside his, with presence that transformed ordinary educational routine into foundation for emotional development that would shape every subsequent relationship he attempted to form. The friendship that developed between them was characterized by innocent intimacy that reflected complete absence of self-consciousness about emotional vulnerability, conversations conducted without awareness that such openness created dependencies that could become sources of devastating pain if circumstances eliminated the person who had become essential to psychological stability and social competence that required constant reinforcement through shared experiences and mutual understanding. Rika's natural warmth and genuine interest in his welfare provided Yuta with first experience of unconditional acceptance that had not been filtered through family obligation or institutional requirement, creating attachment that exceeded normal childhood bonds while remaining within parameters that seemed sustainable and permanent. The ring that he gave her during their final conversation was purchased with allowance money that had been saved through weeks of careful sacrifice, understanding even at young age that symbolic gestures could carry emotional weight that exceeded their material value, while providing tangible evidence of commitments that might otherwise have remained unexpressed, despite their fundamental importance to both participants. The promise that accompanied this gift was made with sincerity that reflected genuine intention to honor obligations that seemed manageable when viewed from perspective of children whose understanding of mortality remained abstract, despite exposure to concepts that adults had attempted to explain through metaphors that obscured rather than illuminated realities that would soon transform theoretical knowledge into personal trauma. The accident that claimed Rika's life occurred with mundane suddenness that highlighted how completely safety was illusion maintained through collective agreement to ignore statistical probabilities that governed random events whose timing and consequences operated according to principles that had nothing to do with individual merit or emotional investment that victims and survivors had made in relationships that could be severed without warning or opportunity for preparation. The intersection where she died was an unremarkable location that would forever carry significance disproportionate to its physical characteristics. Ordinary street corner transformed into monument to loss that no amount of subsequent experience could diminish or rationalize through appeals to natural order that encompassed such tragedies as inevitable features of existence that required acceptance rather than understanding. The grief that overwhelmed Yuta following this loss was not merely emotional response to separation, but psychological crisis that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality and his place within cosmic order that had seemed stable, despite obvious evidence that stability was constructed through selective attention rather than accurate assessment of conditions that governed human experience. The intensity of his mourning exceeded normal parameters for childhood bereavement, while reflecting depth of connection that had been established through years of shared development that had created interdependence neither had recognized, until elimination demonstrated how completely their individual identities had been integrated through mutual care and understanding. But it was the manifestation of Rika's cursed spirit that transformed personal loss into supernatural crisis, whose implications exceeded individual suffering to encompass broader questions about love, death, and the mechanisms through which powerful emotions could reshape reality according to principles that conventional understanding could not adequately address or control. The entity that emerged from his grief was simultaneously Rika and not Rika, possessing memories and personality traits that suggested continuity while demonstrating capabilities and motivations that reflected transformation through processes that had corrupted essential aspects of identity that death should have preserved, rather than perverted into something that served protection through methods that exceeded anything the living girl could have contemplated or approved. The psychological impact of witnessing this manifestation was perhaps more traumatic than her original death had been. Understanding that his love had somehow prevented her peaceful rest, while transforming her into a weapon whose power operated through mechanisms he could neither understand nor control, despite being its apparent source and primary beneficiary. The guilt that accompanied this recognition was enormous, encompassing not just responsibility for preventing her natural transition toward whatever awaited consciousness after death, but active participation in creating circumstances that had corrupted her memory through supernatural processes that his emotional state had triggered without conscious intention or adequate understanding of consequences. The isolation that resulted from Rika's presence was both protective and devastating, her manifestations eliminating physical threats to his safety, while ensuring that social relationships became impossible due to dangers that her protective instincts created for anyone who approached him with intentions she interpreted as potentially harmful regardless of their actual nature or his own preferences about social interaction. The monster that had been created through his love was simultaneously guardian and prison, ensuring his survival while eliminating possibilities for normal human connection that might have provided healing for wounds that her continued existence was preventing from processing naturally. The years that followed were characterized by systematic elimination of everything that made childhood development possible, understanding that Rika's presence had transformed him from ordinary student into existential threat, whose attendance at conventional institutions created risks that exceeded any educational benefits such attendance might have provided. The homeschooling that replaced formal education was conducted by tutors whose primary qualifications were willingness to work with someone whose supernatural circumstances made normal pedagogical relationships impossible, creating learning environment that prioritized safety over intellectual development, while ensuring that his isolation became complete and permanent. The suicidal ideation that emerged during this period was motivated not by simple despair, but by recognition that his continued existence was preventing Rika from finding peace while creating circumstances that made meaningful life impossible for himself and dangerous for everyone whose proximity might trigger manifestations that could result in casualties he would be forced to accept responsibility for, despite lacking conscious control over forces that operated according to emotional states. He could not regulate through mere willpower or conscious decision-making. The attempts he made to eliminate himself were frustrated by Rika's interventions that demonstrated how completely she had become extension of his unconscious desires for survival, despite conscious recognition that death might serve everyone's welfare more effectively than continued existence that brought only suffering to himself, while creating dangers for others whose only crime was attempting to interact with someone whose emotional development had been arrested by trauma that conventional therapeutic approaches could not address adequately. The discovery that he was responsible for Rika's cursed existence, rather than merely its victim, represented psychological breakthrough that was simultaneously liberating and devastating. Understanding that his power over her meant that release was theoretically possible, while highlighting moral responsibility that he had been avoiding through assumption that circumstances were beyond his control, rather than consequences of choices he had made unconsciously, through inability to process grief according to patterns that would have allowed natural healing rather than supernatural perpetuation of attachment that death should have severed. The intervention that brought him to Tokyo, Jujutsu High, was motivated by institutional recognition that his circumstances required specialized attention that conventional mental health services could not provide, while understanding that his potential as sorcerer exceeded even special grade classification due to capabilities that had emerged through processes that remained unprecedented in documented history of cursed energy manifestation and manipulation. The negotiation that secured his enrollment rather than execution was conducted by individuals who understood both risks and opportunities that his education might create, while acknowledging that alternatives to training were limited to elimination that would waste potential, while failing to address underlying problems that his case represented. The curriculum that was designed for his unique circumstances emphasized not just technical development of abilities he already possessed, but psychological healing that might enable him to form healthy relationships while maintaining conscious control over manifestations that had previously operated according to emotional triggers he could not predict or manage through conventional self-discipline. The integration of therapeutic intervention with practical training was unprecedented but necessary, understanding that his technical development was meaningless without corresponding emotional growth that could prevent power from being deployed according to unconscious motivations that served protection but eliminated possibilities for genuine human connection. The relationships that he began to form with classmates during this period were constrained by his fear of exposing them to dangers that Rika's presence created, while being motivated by desperate need for social connection that years of isolation had intensified to levels that made even limited interaction emotionally overwhelming. Despite conscious recognition that such relationships required careful management to prevent incidents that might result in harm to people whose acceptance meant more than his own safety or comfort, the missions that provided real-world testing of his developing capabilities revealed both natural aptitude for combat applications of cursed energy and profound discomfort with violence that seemed to contradict Rika's enthusiastic participation in elimination of threats through methods that exceeded necessity, while reflecting her understanding of protection that had been shaped by supernatural existence rather than human moral considerations that governed normal responses to conflict and danger. The philosophical discussions that emerged during training sessions explored questions about love, death, and responsibility that his circumstances had made urgently practical rather than merely academic, understanding that his relationship with Rika represented extreme example of how powerful emotions could create consequences that exceeded individual control, while remaining subject to conscious choice about how such consequences would be addressed and integrated into broader understanding of what existence could offer when freed from patterns that perpetuated suffering rather than enabling growth. But it was the night parade of 100 demons that provided ultimate test of everything he had learned about power, responsibility, and the relationship between love and protection during months of careful development, under circumstances that had been designed to prevent exactly the kind of crisis that Ghetto's coordinated assault was intended to create. The battle that followed demonstrated both his remarkable capabilities and the psychological costs that deploying such capabilities imposed when motivation transcended mere survival toward active protection of others whose welfare had become meaningful enough to justify risks that exceeded individual safety considerations. The manifestation of Rika at full power during this crisis revealed both her true nature as Queen of Curses and his own role in creating circumstances that had transformed childhood love into cosmic threat, whose elimination had required intervention by forces that operated beyond normal human authority or understanding. The techniques that he deployed during their combined assault exceeded anything that previous generations of sorcerers had achieved, while being motivated by recognition that protection sometimes required complete commitment that admitted no reservation about personal costs that such commitment might demand. The realization that occurred during climactic moments of this battle was that his love for Rika had never been pure or selfless, but had contained elements of possessiveness and need that had prevented him from accepting her death, while transforming their relationship into prison that trapped both of them within patterns that served neither individual welfare nor collective good, that genuine love should have prioritized over personal comfort or emotional satisfaction that came from maintaining connections that natural processes should have been allowed to complete. The release that followed this understanding was accomplished not through technical mastery of cursed energy manipulation, but through emotional growth that enabled him to choose Rika's welfare over his own need for her continued presence, understanding that love sometimes required sacrifice of everything that made such love personally meaningful, while serving purposes that transcended individual desire toward recognition of what genuine care demanded when tested by circumstances that admitted no compromise between competing values. The conversation that preceded their final separation was conducted with honesty that their previous relationship had never achieved. Acknowledgement of mistakes and limitations that had created circumstances requiring such extreme resolution, while expressing gratitude for experiences that had provided foundation for whatever growth had been possible, despite systematic problems that had prevented healthy development until crisis. Forced confrontation with realities that could no longer be avoided through self-deception or emotional manipulation disguised as protective care. The peace that accompanied Rika's departure was different from anything Yuta had experienced since her original death. Understanding that genuine love required acceptance of loss while maintaining commitment to values that such love had helped develop, rather than clinging to forms that preserved personal comfort at cost of continued growth for both. Individuals whose relationship had served its purpose when allowed to conclude naturally rather than being perpetuated through supernatural intervention that corrupted essential aspects of what had once been beautiful and meaningful. The high school where Junpei Yoshino spent his final years was the kind of institution where social hierarchies were established through systematic cruelty that administrators either could not recognize or chose to ignore in favor of maintaining statistical measures of success that looked impressive on evaluation reports, while failing to address underlying problems that made daily attendance an exercise in psychological survival for students whose differences marked them as acceptable targets for ritualized abuse. The classroom where he sat during those interminable hours was filled with peers who had learned to participate in or tolerate behaviors that exceeded mere adolescent awkwardness, to encompass genuine sadism that found expression through methods that left no physical evidence while creating emotional wounds that would never heal completely, regardless of whatever therapeutic intervention might eventually be applied. The bullying that defined his educational experience was not random cruelty, but systematic campaign designed to reinforce his position at bottom of social pyramid while providing entertainment for classmates whose own insecurities were managed through participation in activities that demonstrated their superiority over someone whose vulnerability had been identified and exploited according to principles that governed adolescent pack behavior with ruthless efficiency that adults preferred not to acknowledge or interrupt. The techniques employed against him were sophisticated in their psychological impact, calculated to cause maximum emotional damage, while maintaining plausible deniability that protected perpetrators from consequences that might have interfered with their continued enjoyment of activities that served no constructive purpose, beyond establishing dominance through infliction of suffering. The isolation that resulted from this treatment was both consequence and additional form of punishment. Understanding that his classmates' systematic rejection had eliminated possibilities for forming alliances that might have provided protection or emotional support during periods when abuse escalated beyond normal parameters, while demonstrating that survival required accepting complete social exile as price for avoiding confrontations he could never win through conventional means. The loneliness that characterized his daily existence was profound and deliberate, manufactured through collective decision to treat him as non-person, whose welfare was irrelevant to group dynamics that required his continued degradation as foundation for whatever solidarity his tormentors had achieved through shared participation in his destruction. The academic performance that he maintained, despite these impossible circumstances, reflected not natural resilience, but desperate understanding that educational failure would provide additional justification for abuse while eliminating whatever slim possibilities might have existed for eventually escaping circumstances that had made normal adolescent development impossible through constant exposure to stress that exceeded human capacity to process without permanent psychological damage. The grades he achieved were adequate but meaningless, accomplishments that served no constructive purpose, while requiring energy that might have been better deployed toward developing coping mechanisms or survival strategies that could have provided foundation for eventual recovery. The relationship with his mother, that provided his only source of genuine human connection, was characterized by mutual protection that prevented either from acknowledging how completely his circumstances had affected their domestic environment, understanding that her awareness of his suffering would have created obligations she was not equipped to fulfill, while his recognition of her limitations might have destroyed whatever emotional stability she had achieved through careful avoidance of problems she could not solve through maternal affection or practical intervention. The conversations they shared during evening meals were conducted according to unspoken agreements that maintained facade of normalcy, while avoiding topics that might have revealed how thoroughly his daily experiences contradicted assumptions about institutional safety and social development that she needed to maintain for her own psychological welfare. The love that connected them was real but constrained by recognition that honest communication would have imposed burdens on relationship that was already strained by circumstances neither could control through individual effort or mutual support that was inadequate for addressing problems whose scope exceeded family resources. The hobbies that occupied his solitary hours were selected not for enjoyment, but for their capacity to provide temporary escape from awareness of social rejection, while creating skills that served no practical purpose beyond filling time that might otherwise have been spent contemplating circumstances that offered no realistic prospects for improvement. Regardless of how thoroughly he analyzed problems, or how carefully he planned responses to situations that were designed to defeat any resistance he might have been capable of organizing or sustaining. The movies that became his primary source of emotional sustenance were chosen for their portrayal of characters who faced circumstances similar to his own, while achieving outcomes that suggested possibilities for transformation or revenge that his real-world situation could never accommodate. Understanding that fictional narratives provided framework for processing experiences that exceeded normal adolescent challenges, while offering models for thinking about justice and retribution that conventional moral education had failed to address adequately given complexities that his circumstances had revealed. The philosophical framework that emerged from this analysis was focused on questions about suffering and meaning that most teenagers never confronted directly. Understanding that his experiences had forced premature confrontation with existential issues that typically remained abstract until adult responsibilities created contexts where such questions became practically relevant rather than merely academic exercises in theoretical exploration of possibilities that seemed remote from immediate concerns about survival and psychological stability. The moment that would change everything began with encounter that seemed to offer exactly what years of isolation had taught him to believe was impossible. Meeting with individual who appeared to understand his circumstances, while possessing both sympathy for his suffering and power to address problems that had proven immune to conventional intervention through institutional channels or personal effort. Mahito's approach was masterful in its psychological manipulation, providing validation and friendship that had been systematically denied, while offering solutions that seemed reasonable given accumulated evidence that normal methods for addressing abuse had proven completely inadequate. The conversations that developed during this relationship revealed both Junpei's desperate need for human connection and his sophisticated understanding of moral complexities that his experiences had forced him to confront. Discussions about justice and society that reflected intelligence and sensitivity that had survived despite systematic efforts to destroy his sense of individual worth through methods that had succeeded in eliminating most aspects of normal social development, while failing to corrupt essential aspects of character that remained intact beneath layers of defensive mechanisms that protected him from complete psychological collapse. The technique that Mahito taught him was presented as a tool for self-defense that would finally provide means for addressing abuse through methods that conventional authority figures had proven unwilling or unable to implement. Understanding that supernatural abilities offered possibilities for achieving justice that normal social systems had systematically denied, while creating opportunities for revenge that exceeded anything he could have accomplished through conventional resistance or institutional complaint that had been ignored or dismissed. But the corruption that accompanied this empowerment was subtle and systematic, designed to gradually eliminate moral boundaries that might have prevented complete transformation from victim to perpetrator, while providing justification for actions that served Mahito's purposes rather than Junpei's genuine welfare or psychological healing that required different kinds of intervention than revenge could provide. Regardless of how satisfying such revenge might have seemed when viewed from perspective of someone whose suffering had exceeded normal human capacity to endure without some form of meaningful response. The first application of his new abilities was directed against classmates whose cruelty had created circumstances that made supernatural intervention seem like appropriate response to problems that had proven immune to conventional solutions. Understanding that his transformation represented opportunity to reverse power dynamics that had defined his existence, while demonstrating that systematic abuse carried consequences that exceeded whatever protection institutional indifference had previously provided to those who had participated in his torment without fear of meaningful retaliation. The satisfaction that accompanied these initial demonstrations of power was intoxicating and dangerous, providing emotional rewards that years of victimization had taught him to believe were impossible, while creating psychological dependency on methods that served immediate gratification rather than long-term healing that would have required different approaches to processing trauma and building capacity for healthy relationships that transcended cycles of abuse and revenge that Mahito was deliberately perpetuating for purposes that had nothing to do with Junpei's actual welfare. The philosophical discussions that continued throughout this period revealed how thoroughly his worldview was being reshaped through exposure to ideas that validated his anger while providing intellectual framework for justifying actions that contradicted moral principles he had once accepted, despite their failure to protect him from systematic cruelty that had defined his educational experience. The reasoning that emerged from these conversations was internally consistent but morally horrifying. Logic that led inexorably toward conclusions that justified violence against innocent people as necessary component of broader campaign against social systems that had failed to provide adequate protection or justice. But it was the murder of his mother that shattered whatever psychological barriers might have prevented complete surrender to Mahito's influence. Understanding that her death had been orchestrated specifically to eliminate his final connection to values and relationships that might have provided foundation for resistance to transformation that would complete his journey from victim to weapon in service of purposes that transcended individual revenge towards systematic destruction of human civilization that had created conditions where such suffering was possible. The grief that overwhelmed him following this loss was not merely emotional response to personal tragedy, but complete collapse of meaning systems that had sustained him through years of abuse, while providing hope that circumstances might eventually improve. through natural processes or institutional intervention that would address problems whose existence had been systematically denied by authority figures, whose responsibility had been to provide protection rather than maintaining statistical measures that concealed rather than addressed underlying dysfunction. The rage that replaced his grief was carefully cultivated and directed by Mahito toward targets that served strategic purposes rather than emotional satisfaction. Understanding that Junpei's pain was being weaponized to achieve objectives that had nothing to do with justice or healing, while exploiting psychological vulnerabilities that his experiences had created through exposure to cruelty that exceeded normal parameters for adolescent social development. The transformation that followed was both physical and psychological, supernatural modification that reflected internal changes that had been building throughout his relationship with Mahito, while providing external manifestation of corruption that had been proceeding, according to careful plan designed to eliminate whatever remained of individual identity that might have provided resistance to complete subsumption into role as instrument of destruction rather than person whose welfare mattered for reasons that transcended utility. The attack that he conducted against his former school was motivated by a combination of personal vendetta and manipulation that had convinced him such action served broader purposes that justified casualties among people who had been bystanders rather than active participants in his abuse. Understanding that his moral reasoning had been systematically corrupted through exposure to philosophical frameworks that prioritized abstract justice over individual human welfare, while providing intellectual justification for actions that served revenge rather than protection or healing. The encounter with Yuji Itadori that preceded his death represented final opportunity for connection with someone who understood suffering while maintaining commitment to values that might have provided foundation for different responses to trauma and injustice. Conversation that revealed both possibilities that had been destroyed through Mahito's manipulation and potential for redemption that remained theoretically available despite systematic corruption that had occurred through months of careful psychological warfare designed to eliminate exactly such possibilities. The moment of recognition that occurred during this exchange was both tragic and redemptive, understanding that his transformation had been orchestrated by someone whose interest in his welfare had been purely instrumental, while his genuine needs for connection and meaning had been exploited to serve purposes that had nothing to do with addressing problems that had made such exploitation possible or preventing similar circumstances from affecting other vulnerable individuals whose circumstances might create similar opportunities for manipulation. The death that concluded his existence was meaningless in ways that exceeded even systematic abuse he had endured throughout his educational experience. Final demonstration of how completely his life had been wasted through institutional failures that had created conditions where such waste was possible while providing no meaningful response to problems that his circumstances had revealed. About social systems that prioritized appearance over reality and statistical success over individual welfare that gave meaning to whatever achievements such systems might have claimed. Junpei Yoshino had been destroyed not by single act of cruelty, but by systematic failure of every institution and individual whose responsibility had been to provide protection and guidance during vulnerable period when personality was being shaped through experiences that would determine his capacity for healthy relationships and meaningful contribution to community welfare. Understanding that his transformation from victim to perpetrator represented not individual moral failure, but collective abandonment that had eliminated possibilities for development while creating conditions where manipulation became possible through exploitation of needs that normal social development should have addressed through constructive rather than destructive means. His story served as warning about costs of indifference to suffering that seemed manageable when viewed from perspective of those whose circumstances had protected them from similar vulnerability, while demonstrating how completely individual potential could be wasted when social systems failed to provide adequate support for those whose differences made them targets for abuse that exceeded normal parameters for adolescent social development, creating tragedies that could have been prevented through recognition that protection required active intervention rather than passive hope, that problems would resolve themselves without institutional commitment to addressing underlying causes, rather than merely managing symptoms after damage had already been done. And so we reach the gentle conclusion of our journey through the wounded hearts that beat within the world of Jujutsu sorcery, having traced the intricate patterns of suffering that transform ordinary pain into extraordinary purpose, while revealing how trauma becomes the forge where strength is shaped from raw human vulnerability. Each soul we have encountered carries scars that map their individual paths through darkness toward whatever light they could create or discover, understanding that healing is not erasure of wounds, but integration of experience into wisdom that serves protection of others who face similar struggles. The threads that connect these stories are not mere narrative convenience, but recognition that suffering shared becomes suffering transformed. Individual trauma, transcending personal boundaries, to create collective understanding about what it means to persist, despite circumstances that provide every justification for surrender. In the space between wounding and wisdom lies the territory where heroes are made, not through absence of fear, but through choice, to continue loving, despite evidence that love creates vulnerability that enemies will exploit without hesitation or mercy. Rest now, weary traveler, carrying with you the understanding that even the most profound darkness cannot extinguish light that burns within spirits committed to protection rather than destruction, healing rather than perpetuation of cycles that transform victims into perpetrators. Let these stories of beautiful, broken people remind you that strength is not measured by absence of scars, but by willingness to remain open to connection, despite knowing that such openness invites both joy and sorrow in measures that no calculation can predict or control. Sleep peacefully in the knowledge that trauma survived with humanity intact is victory more complete than any technical mastery or supernatural power. Sweet dreams embracing you with the gentle weight of understanding that makes suffering bearable through recognition of shared human experience that transforms isolation into communion with all who have chosen to endure rather than surrender. Hope that tomorrow might offer opportunities for growth, that yesterday's pain makes possible rather than prevents,